Hello, how are you?
The story of Pokémon doesn't begin in a corporate boardroom or a high-tech laboratory. It begins in the fields and forests of rural Japan, where a young boy named Satoshi Tajiri spent his childhood catching insects. Tajiri was fascinated by the world of bugs. He would explore ditches, ponds, and grassy areas near his home in Mashida, a suburb of Tokyo, collecting beetles, tadpoles, and other creatures. His friends called him Dr. Bug because of his obsessive interest in cataloguing and studying these small animals. This childhood passion would become the seed from which Pokémon would eventually grow. As Tajiri grew older, the fields where he once caught insects began to disappear. Urban development was transforming the Japanese landscape, paving over the natural spaces where children had once played. Tajiri watched this transformation with sadness, but he also discovered a new passion that would replace his bug-catching expeditions: video games. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, arcade games were exploding in popularity across Japan. Tajiri became obsessed with games like Space Invaders, spending hours in arcades studying their mechanics and design. He wasn't content just to play these games. He wanted to understand how they worked, to peek behind the curtain and see the code that made the magic happen. In 1981, at the age of just 16, Tajiri and several friends started a gaming fanzine called Game Freak. The magazine was entirely handwritten and photocopied, featuring game reviews, tips, and exploits that Tajiri and his team had discovered. Game Freak wasn't a professional publication, but it was passionate and detailed, and it attracted a small but dedicated readership among Japan's gaming community. Over time, the magazine evolved from a hobby into something more serious. Tajiri began to see Game Freak not just as a fanzine, but as a potential game development company. By 1989, Tajiri and his friend Ken Sugimori, who'd been contributing illustrations to the Game Freak magazine, decided to transform their passion project into an actual game development studio. They officially founded Game Freak as a company, with Tajiri as director and Sugimori as the lead artist. Their first commercial game, Quinty, was released for the Famicom in Japan, and later localized as Mendel Palace for the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America. The game was modest but well received, demonstrating that the Game Freak team had real talent. But Tajiri wasn't satisfied with creating conventional games. He wanted to create something that captured the magic of his childhood, something that would let a new generation of children experience the joy of collecting and discovering creatures, even in a world where the fields and forests were disappearing. The inspiration for what would become Pokémon struck Tajiri when he saw children playing with Nintendo's Game Boy. The handheld console released in 1989 was a revolutionary device. It allowed people to play video games anywhere, transforming gaming from a stationary experience tied to television screens into something portable and personal. But what caught Tajiri's attention wasn't just the portability of the Game Boy. It was the link cable, an accessory that allowed two Game Boy systems to connect and communicate with each other. When Tajiri saw this cable, he imagined something magical. Creatures travelling along the cable from one Game Boy to another, moving between worlds. This image became the core concept of Pokémon. Tajiri began developing his idea in the early 1990s. He envisioned a game where players would explore a vast world, capturing creatures and training them to battle against other trainers. The creatures could be traded between players using the link cable, encouraging social interaction and cooperation. But more than that, Tajiri wanted to recreate the feeling he'd had as a child, the thrill of discovering a rare insect, the excitement of showing it to friends, and the satisfaction of building a complete collection. He wanted children who had never experienced the joy of catching bugs in a field to feel that same sense of wonder and discovery. Convincing Nintendo to support this ambitious project was no easy task. Tajiri pitched his concept to Shigeru Miyamoto, the legendary game designer behind Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. Miyamoto saw potential in Tajiri's vision, but he also recognized the enormous challenges involved. The Game Boy was a limited platform with minimal processing power, a tiny monochrome screen, and severe memory constraints. Creating a game with hundreds of different creatures, each with unique abilities and characteristics, seemed almost impossible given these technical limitations. Moreover, the Game Boy was approaching the end of its commercial life by the mid-1990s. Many at Nintendo questioned whether it made sense to invest in a massive new title for aging hardware. Despite these concerns, Miyamoto championed Tajiri's project. He believed in the core concept and saw something special in the young developer's passion and creativity. Nintendo agreed to provide funding and support, though the company's commitment was cautious. The project that would become Pokémon was initially known by the codename Capsule Monsters, referencing the capsules in which the creatures would be stored. Later the name evolved to Pocket Monsters, which would eventually be shortened to Pokémon for international markets. Development of the game began in earnest around 1990, but progress was slow and painful. Game Freak was a small studio with limited resources, and the technical challenges were immense. Tajiri and his team had to figure out how to compress data efficiently enough to fit 151 different creatures, multiple towns and routes, battle mechanics, and an engaging story all into a single Game Boy cartridge. The memory limitations meant that every single byte of data had to be carefully managed. Nothing could be wasted. Meanwhile, Game Freak was struggling financially. The company was barely staying afloat, and several team members had to take side jobs to support themselves while working on the Pokémon project. Tajiri himself reportedly didn't take a salary for years during development, surviving on financial support from his father. Ken Sugimori played a crucial role during this period. As the lead artist, Sugimori was responsible for designing the creatures that would populate the Pokémon world. Each design had to be memorable, appealing, and distinct, even when rendered in the simple pixelated style required by the Game Boy's limited graphics capabilities. Sugimori drew inspiration from a wide range of sources: animals, plants, mythology, everyday objects, and pure imagination. Some designs came quickly and naturally, while others went through dozens of iterations before finding their final form. The goal was to create creatures that would appeal to children while also feeling like they could exist in a coherent living world. One of the most important decisions made during development was the choice to create not one but two versions of the game, red and green. This decision was driven both by practical and design considerations. From a technical standpoint, releasing two versions allowed the team to split the creature roster between the games, reducing the data that needed to fit on each individual cartridge. But more importantly, it created a built-in incentive for players to interact with each other. Certain Pokémon would only be available in one version, meaning that to complete a full collection, players would need to trade with friends who owned the other version. This mechanic transformed Pokémon from a solitary experience into a social one, encouraging the kind of sharing and interaction that Tajiri had experienced when collecting insects as a child. Development dragged on for 6 long years. By 1996, the Game Boy was truly showing its age. Nintendo had already released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and was planning the Nintendo 64, their next-generation console. Many within Nintendo questioned whether releasing a new Game Boy title at this late stage made any sense. The handheld market seemed to be moving in a different direction, and there was real doubt about whether Japanese children would embrace a game on what was essentially outdated hardware. But Tajiri and his team persevered. They poured everything they had into the project, refining the battle system, polishing the overworld exploration, and ensuring that each of the 151 Pokémon felt unique and special. They created a narrative structure that was simple but engaging, casting the player as a young trainer setting out on a journey to become a Pokémon master. Along the way, players would challenge 8 gym leaders, thwart the plans of a criminal organization called Team Rocket, and ultimately face the Elite Four and the champion to prove themselves as the greatest trainer in the region. The story was straightforward, but it provided a clear sense of progression and purpose that kept players engaged. Finally, after 6 years of development, countless setbacks, and near financial ruin, Pocket Monsters Red and Green were released in Japan on February 27, 1996. The launch was modest. Nintendo didn't have high expectations for the titles, and the marketing budget was limited. Initial sales were slow. In its first month, the game sold only a few 100,000 copies, respectable but not extraordinary numbers for a Nintendo-published title. Many at Nintendo assumed the game would have a brief, modest run, and then fade into obscurity. No one could have predicted what was about to happen next. What happened next was something unprecedented in the video game industry. Pokémon didn't explode overnight. Instead, it grew through word of mouth, slowly but steadily gaining momentum over the months following its release. Japanese children began talking about the game at school, sharing tips about where to find rare Pokémon and strategies for defeating tough gym leaders. The trading mechanic proved to be brilliant. Kids brought their Game Boys to school specifically to trade Pokémon with friends during recess, and the social aspect of the game became just as important as the gameplay itself. Within a few months, Pokémon went from a modest success to a genuine phenomenon in Japan. By late 1996, demand for the games was soaring. Store shelves couldn't keep cartridges in stock. Nintendo quickly realized they had something special on their hands, something that was tapping into a cultural nerve in a way few games ever had. The success was driven by several factors working in harmony. First, the collecting aspect of the game was deeply satisfying. The tagline "Gotta catch 'em all" wasn't just marketing, it captured the core appeal of the experience. Each Pokémon felt like a small achievement, and working toward a complete Pokédex gave players a long-term goal that kept them engaged for dozens of hours. Second, the battle system had surprising depth. On the surface, Pokémon battles appeared simple. Each creature had up to 4 moves, and players took turns selecting actions until one side fainted. But beneath this simplicity lay a complex web of type matchups, stat calculations, and strategic considerations. Water-type moves were strong against fire types, but weak against grass types. Certain Pokémon had high attack stats but low defense, making them powerful but fragile. Understanding these nuances and building a balanced team required thought and experimentation. Young players could enjoy the game without mastering these systems, but those who dug deeper found rich strategic gameplay that rivaled much more complex titles. Third, the world of Pokémon felt alive and full of secrets. The Kanto region, based loosely on the real-world Kanto region of Japan, was packed with hidden areas, optional side quests, and mysterious Pokémon that could only be found under specific conditions. One of the most famous examples was Mew, a legendary Pokémon that was not officially advertised but could be obtained through special promotional events. rumors about Mew spread like wildfire among Japanese schoolchildren, with elaborate theories about how to find it through normal gameplay. These rumors were never confirmed, adding to the mystique and encouraging players to explore every corner of the game in search of secrets. While the video games are the foundation of Pokémon, the franchise's true power lies in its expansion beyond interactive entertainment into a comprehensive multimedia empire. Pokémon has successfully leveraged its core concept across virtually every form of media and product category, creating a self-reinforcing ecosystem where each component drives interest in the others. Understanding Pokémon's full impact requires examining how the franchise extended beyond Game Boy screens into television, theaters, card shops, toy stores, and countless other spaces. The Pokémon anime, which premiered in Japan on April 1, 1997, played an absolutely crucial role in establishing the franchise as a cultural phenomenon rather than just a successful game series. The show followed Ash Ketchum, a 10-year-old boy from Pallet Town who dreamed of becoming a Pokémon master. Accompanied by his rebellious Pikachu and joined by various companions over the years, Ash travelled through different regions, catching Pokémon, battling gym leaders, and thwarting the schemes of the bumbling Team Rocket trio of Jessie, James, and Meowth. The anime made several important decisions that shaped how audiences perceived Pokémon. First, it gave Pokémon distinct personalities and voices, making them feel like living creatures rather than just game pieces. Pikachu's refusal to evolve and preference for staying with Ash created an emotional core that transcended gameplay mechanics. Second, it emphasized the bonds between trainers and their Pokémon, framing the series as fundamentally about friendship and cooperation rather than just combat. And third, it provided ongoing episodic adventures that kept Pokémon in front of audiences continuously, maintaining engagement between game releases. The anime structure evolved over its now over 100 episodes spanning more than 25 years. Each new game generation brought new seasons of the anime, with Ash travelling to the corresponding region, meeting new companions, and encountering new Pokémon. This parallel structure kept the anime and games synchronized, with the show introducing audiences to new Pokémon before they appeared in games, or reinforcing interest in recently released titles. Major story arcs coincided with game launches, creating marketing synergy that benefited both products. In 2023, the anime made a dramatic shift with Pokémon Horizons, the series, which retired Ash Ketchum as the protagonist after over 25 years. The new series follows Liko and Roy, two young trainers on a different kind of journey, exploring mysteries and adventures disconnected from the traditional gym challenge structure. This change reflected Pokémon's willingness to evolve even its most established properties, and suggested that the franchise was thinking about long-term sustainability rather than relying indefinitely on a single character. The Pokémon trading card game launched in Japan in October 1996 and internationally in 1999, became the second pillar of the franchise's multimedia approach. The TCG translated Pokémon battles into a card-based format, where players built decks and competed against each other using cards representing Pokémon, trainer items, and energy. The game was designed to be accessible to younger players while still offering strategic depth for serious competitors, much like the video games themselves. The TCG's success was immediate and sustained. Children collected cards for their artwork and the excitement of opening booster packs, while competitive players built optimized decks for tournaments. Rare holographic cards became valuable collectibles, with some cards from early sets eventually selling for thousands of dollars. The social aspect of trading cards mirrored the social dimension of the video games, creating another layer of interaction among fans. School playgrounds became venues for both video game link cable trades and physical card trades, reinforcing Pokemon's omnipresence in children's lives. The Pokémon Company, formed in 1998 as a joint venture between Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures Inc., managed the trading card game and much of Pokémon's merchandising and brand expansion. This organization ensured coordination across different Pokémon products and helped maintain consistent quality and messaging. The Pokémon Company would become instrumental in expanding the franchise internationally and managing its growth into new markets and product categories. Pokémon movies became annual events, starting with Pokémon the first movie, Mewtwo Strikes Back, in 1998 in Japan and 1999 internationally. These theatrical releases featured higher production values than the television anime, original stories, and often introduced new, legendary or mythical Pokémon before they appeared in games. The first movie was a cultural event in North America, grossing over $163 million domestically, and becoming one of the highest-grossing anime films in the Western market. Its exploration of themes like identity, artificial life, and the ethics of genetic engineering was surprisingly sophisticated for a children's film. Subsequent Pokémon movies followed annually, each tied to the current generation and region. Some films told original stories, while others adapted or reimagined game plots. The movies ranged in quality and reception, but they served important functions in maintaining franchise visibility and providing special Pokémon distributions through event tie-ins. The 2019 live-action film Detective Pikachu represented a new direction, featuring realistic CGI Pokémon in a mystery story aimed at both children and adults who had grown up with the franchise. Its success, grossing over $433 million worldwide, demonstrated Pokémon's cross-generational appeal and its viability in different cinematic styles. Pokémon merchandise extends into virtually every product category imaginable. Toys, from action figures to plushies, have been consistent bestsellers since the franchise's early days. The Pokémon Center retail chain, which started in Japan and eventually expanded internationally, offers exclusive Pokémon merchandise and serves as pilgrimage sites for dedicated fans. Clothing, accessories, home goods, school supplies, food products, and countless other items bear Pokémon branding, generating billions of dollars in revenue annually. The scope of Pokémon merchandising is staggering. There have been Pokémon-branded credit cards, airplanes with Pokémon livery, themed hotel rooms, restaurant collaborations, and even a Pokémon-themed train line in Japan. The character of Pikachu has become one of the most recognizable mascots in the world, comparable to Mickey Mouse or Hello Kitty in terms of global brand recognition. This omnipresence keeps Pokémon constantly visible in daily life, reinforcing its cultural relevance and introducing the franchise to new audiences who might not initially be gamers. Pokémon Go, released in July 2016, represented Pokémon's most successful expansion into mobile gaming and arguably one of the most significant moments in the franchise's history. Developed by Niantic in collaboration with the Pokémon Company, Pokémon Go used augmented reality and GPS technology to place Pokémon in the real world. Players would walk around their actual neighborhoods and cities with their phone screens showing Pokémon superimposed on real environments. The game encouraged exploration, social interaction, and physical activity, creating a phenomenon that transcended gaming and became a global cultural event. In its first months, Pokémon Go was everywhere. News reports covered the masses of players gathering in parks and public spaces. Stories emerged of people discovering their neighborhoods in new ways, forming friendships, and even encountering unexpected situations while hunting for Pokémon. The game broke numerous records, reaching 100 million downloads faster than any mobile game before it. At its peak, Pokémon Go was generating over 2 million in revenue per day. While the initial frenzy eventually cooled, the game maintained a substantial and dedicated player base, continuing to generate significant revenue years after launch and demonstrating the power of Pokémon's brand in the mobile space. The success of Pokémon across all these media and product categories has made it the highest grossing media franchise of all time. As of 2024, the Pokémon franchise has generated over 150 billion in revenue across its lifetime, surpassing properties like Star Wars, Marvel, and Harry Potter. This astonishing figure comes from the combination of video game sales, trading card sales, merchandise, box office receipts, mobile game revenue, licensing deals, and countless other sources. No single component dominates. Rather, the strength comes from the franchise's breadth and the way different products support and enhance each other. This multimedia approach created a business model that has been studied and attempted by countless other franchises. The key to Pokémon's success was simultaneity and synergy. New games, new anime seasons, new card sets, new movies, and new merchandise all launched in coordinated waves, each one driving interest in the others. A child might watch the Pokémon anime, become interested in the creatures, play the games to catch them, buy cards to collect them, purchase plushies of their favourites, and wear Pokémon clothing. Each touchpoint reinforced the others, creating a comprehensive relationship with the brand. The franchise's international expansion was carefully managed to ensure success in diverse markets. Pokémon was localized not just linguistically, but culturally, with names, references, and sometimes visual elements adjusted for different regions. The anime removed or altered content that might not translate well culturally. Merchandise was adapted to local tastes and preferences. This attention to localization helped Pokémon avoid the cultural barriers that had limited some other Japanese properties in Western markets. Pokémon's competitive scene has also grown into a substantial component of the franchise. The Pokémon World Championships, held annually since 2004, bring together the best players in video game battling and trading card game competition from around the world. These events are broadcast online, attracting hundreds of thousands of viewers and offering significant prize pools. The existence of a competitive scene gives depth to both the games and the TCG, creating aspirational goals for serious players and demonstrating that Pokémon offers challenges for all skill levels. The franchise has successfully navigated generational change, maintaining relevance for adults who grew up with Pokémon while continuing to attract new children. Nostalgia-driven products like the remakes of classic games, anniversary celebrations, and references to earlier generations in new content keep older fans engaged. Meanwhile, the continuous release of new games, new anime, and new products ensures that each new generation of children discovers Pokémon for themselves. This multi-generational appeal is rare and represents one of Pokémon's greatest strengths. Pokémon's cultural impact extends beyond commercial success into broader social and cultural phenomena. The franchise has inspired art, music, fashion, and countless fan creations. Fan communities have created elaborate theory about Pokémon lore, designed their own Pokémon, written extensive fan fiction, and produced impressive fan games. This creative engagement with the franchise enriches the Pokémon universe and demonstrates the deep emotional connections many fans have developed with these creatures in this world. As Pokémon's popularity exploded in Japan, Nintendo began to consider international expansion. The decision to bring Pokémon to North America and Europe was not made lightly. The game was deeply rooted in Japanese culture and there were real concerns about whether it would resonate with Western audiences. Many Nintendo executives worried that American children in particular would find the game too cutesy or too Japanese. The monsters were stylized and colorful, the gameplay was turn-based rather than action-oriented, and the emphasis on collecting and trading seemed potentially niche. However, there was a strong advocate for localization within Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, the president of Nintendo's American division and son-in-law of Nintendo's president Hiroshi Yamauchi. Arakawa believed that Pokémon could succeed internationally if it was marketed correctly. He pushed for a comprehensive localization effort that would adapt the games for Western audiences while preserving their core appeal. This effort was massive in scope. Every Pokémon needed an English name that captured the spirit of the original Japanese name while being memorable and pronounceable for English speakers. The text needed to be translated in a way that felt natural to Western players, and the marketing needed to position Pokémon as cool and exciting, not just cute. The cultural impact of Pokémon extends far beyond sales figures and revenue statistics. For millions of people around the world, Pokémon has been a formative part of their childhoods, shaping how they think about gaming, storytelling, and even their relationships with others. The franchise has influenced multiple generations, created shared cultural touchstones, and demonstrated the power of Japanese creative properties in the global marketplace. Understanding Pokémon's legacy requires looking at both its tangible impacts on the entertainment industry and its more intangible effects on culture and society. Pokémon fundamentally changed how the video game industry thought about franchises. Before Pokémon, most game series consisted of sequels that built on previous entries with improved graphics and refined mechanics. Pokémon pioneered a different model. Each generation was both a continuation and a fresh start, accessible to newcomers while rewarding longtime fans. The paired version releases encourage social interaction and trading. The multimedia approach showed how games could be the center of a larger entertainment ecosystem. These innovations influenced how other franchises approached sequels, expansion, and brand building. The monster collecting genre, which existed before Pokémon but was relatively niche, exploded in the wake of Pokémon's success. Countless games have tried to capture Pokémon's magic, from Digimon to Yokai Watch to Temtem and beyond. Some succeeded in carving out their own identities, while others faded into obscurity. But the existence of this thriving subgenre is a direct result of Pokémon demonstrating its viability and appeal. The influence extends beyond obvious imitators. Elements of Pokémon's collecting and training systems can be seen in games across various genres. Pokémon helped establish the viability of Japanese properties in Western markets during a time when such success was far from guaranteed. In the late 1990s, anime and manga were still relatively niche interests in North America and Europe. Pokémon's mainstream breakthrough helped pave the way for other Japanese properties to find global audiences. The success of series like Naruto, One Piece, and Dragon Ball in Western markets owes something to the doors Pokémon opened and the audiences it helped cultivate. The franchise has also had educational impacts that are sometimes overlooked. Pokémon games encourage reading, as players must navigate text-heavy interfaces and follow storylines. They introduce basic strategic thinking through battle mechanics and team building. The collecting aspect teaches goal setting and persistence, and the social elements of trading and battling develop communication and social skills. While Pokémon was never designed primarily as an educational tool, many teachers and parents have recognized these incidental benefits and incorporated Pokémon into learning contexts. Pokémon Go's impact on augmented reality gaming and mobile entertainment cannot be overstated. The game demonstrated that AR technology could create compelling mainstream experiences, not just tech demos or niche applications. It showed that mobile games could get people moving and exploring their physical environment rather than remaining sedentary. And it proved that nostalgia and established IP could drive enormous success in the mobile space. The wave of location-based AR games that followed, from Harry Potter, Wizards Unite to various licensed properties, all trace their lineage back to Pokémon Go's breakthrough. The franchises created shared cultural moments that unite people across demographics and geographies. The original Pokémania of the late 1990s was a genuine cultural phenomenon, with Pokémon dominating playgrounds, television, and popular discourse in ways that few children's properties have achieved. The release of Pokémon Go in 2016 created another such moment, with people of all ages gathering in public spaces to play together. Game releases like Pokémon Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet generate massive online conversations, with millions of players sharing experiences simultaneously. These shared moments create collective memories and cultural touchstones. Pokémon has also influenced how people think about collecting and completion. The phrase, "gotta catch 'em all," encapsulates a particular mindset about experiencing content thoroughly rather than just reaching an ending. This completionist approach has influenced game design broadly, with many modern games incorporating collection mechanics, Pokédex-style catalogues, and achievement systems that encourage players to experience every aspect of the content. The satisfaction of filling in that last Pokédex entry, or obtaining every achievement in a game, traces back, in part, to what Pokémon taught players about the joy of completion. The franchise's representation of diversity has evolved over its lifetime, reflecting broader social changes. Early games featured limited character customization and defaulted to male protagonists, though female options were added relatively early. More recent generations have offered extensive character customization, allowing players to create avatars that better reflect their own identities. The games have gradually included more diverse character designs and cultural representations, though this remains an area where some fans hope to see continued growth. The themes explored in recent games, from environmentalism to mental health to family trauma, show willingness to engage with complex social issues in age-appropriate ways. Pokémon's economic impact extends beyond direct franchise revenue. The franchise supports jobs for thousands of people across game development, animation, card printing, merchandise manufacturing, retail, content creation, competitive gaming, and countless other fields. Pokémon-related tourism brings visitors to Japan and other locations associated with the franchise. The secondary market for Pokémon cards and merchandise creates its own ecosystem of collectors, sellers, and enthusiasts. The economic ripples from Pokémon's success touch many sectors and communities. The competitive Pokémon scene has grown into a legitimate esport, though one with a somewhat different character than traditional esports like League of Legends or Counter-Strike. Pokémon's turn-based nature makes it more strategic and less reflexive, appealing to different types of competitors. The existence of both video game and trading card game competitions at the highest levels gives Pokémon a unique position in competitive gaming. Top players are recognized within the community and can earn substantial prize money, though Pokémon competition hasn't reached the same mainstream visibility as some other esports. Still, the competitive scene adds depth and longevity to the franchise, giving dedicated players goals to pursue beyond completing the Pokédex. Pokémon has inspired countless creators across various media. Fan artists have produced enormous amounts of Pokémon art, From careful studies of individual creatures to elaborate illustrations of trainers and teams to creative reimaginings that explore different styles and interpretations. Fan musicians have created remixes, covers, and original compositions inspired by Pokémon's iconic music. Fan game developers have created impressive projects, from difficulty hacks of official games to completely original fan games that explore new regions and mechanics. This creative community engagement enriches the franchise and demonstrates the deep emotional investment fans have in this world. The preservation of Pokémon's history has become a community concern as the franchise has aged. Older games, particularly those from the Game Boy and Game Boy Color eras, face threats from battery death in cartridges and the eventual failure of aging hardware. Online features for DS and 3DS games have been shut down, eliminating trading and battling capabilities for those generations. Fan communities have worked to preserve this history through emulation, documentation, and archival efforts. The question of how to maintain access to Pokémon's legacy as technology advances remains ongoing, with implications for game preservation more broadly. Pokémon's influence on language and communication is surprisingly extensive. Phrases like "gotta catch 'em all," "I choose you," and "it's super effective" have entered common parlance, understood even by people who have never played the games. Pokémon names are recognized globally, with Pikachu in particular achieving a level of cultural penetration comparable to the most iconic characters in entertainment. The franchise has influenced slang, memes, and online communication in ways both obvious and subtle. Looking toward the future, Pokémon faces both opportunities and challenges. The franchise must continue to innovate to avoid stagnation, while respecting the traditions and expectations that fans hold dear. It must balance the demands of annual or near-annual releases with the need for technical polish and quality. It must navigate increasingly complex discussions about representation, accessibility, and social responsibility. And it must continue to find ways to surprise and delight audiences who have been with these creatures for nearly 3 decades. The technological frontier offers exciting possibilities. Virtual reality could provide immersive Pokémon experiences that make players feel truly present in the world. Improved AI could create more dynamic and responsive Pokémon behaviors. Cloud gaming might enable persistent shared Pokémon worlds that evolve over time. The metaverse concept, for all its hype and skepticism, could offer new ways for fans to interact with Pokémon and each other. Which of these possibilities will be realized, and how successfully, remains to be seen. From a single man catching bugs in the Japanese countryside to a global empire worth over $150 billion, the story of Pokémon is extraordinary by any measure. It is a story of creative vision, with Satoshi Tajiri's childhood passion transformed into a concept that would resonate with millions. It is a story of perseverance, with Game Freak nearly going bankrupt during the 6-year development of the first games. It is a story of timing, with Pokémon arriving at the perfect moment to capture the imagination of a generation and ride the wave of emerging technologies and global connectivity. But more than anything, Pokémon is a story about connection. Connection between people, facilitated by trading, battling, and shared experiences. Connection between generations, with parents introducing children to the same creatures they loved as kids. Connection between the real and virtual worlds, with Pokémon bridging the gap between digital entertainment and physical play. And connection between humans and the creatures of imagination that populate our stories and our games. The Pokémon that live in our Game Boys, our 3DS systems, our Switches, and our smartphones are more than just collections of pixels and code. They are companions, partners, friends. They are vessels for our creativity and imagination. They are reminders of simpler times and gateways to new adventures. They are, in their own way, alive in our hearts and minds, as real as anything that exists in the intangible space of memory and emotion. As we look back across nearly 30 years of Pokémon history, what stands out is not just the commercial success or the cultural impact, though both are remarkable. What stands out is the joy, the simple, pure joy of discovery when you encounter a new Pokémon for the first time, the excitement of catching a rare creature after hours of searching, the satisfaction of finally defeating a tough gym leader or completing your Pokédex, the warmth of trading with a friend and seeing their face light up when they receive a Pokémon they've been seeking. These moments of joy, multiplied across millions of players and billions of experiences, are Pokémon's true legacy. The localization team worked tirelessly to prepare Pokémon for its Western debut. They made several important decisions that would shape how the franchise was perceived internationally. First, they changed the name from Pocket Monsters to Pokémon, which sounded more streamlined and modern in English. Second, they combined the original red and green versions into red and blue, with blue featuring slightly updated graphics and bug fixes that had been implemented in the Japanese blue version that was released later as a special edition. Third, they adapted the Pokémon names to work in English, sometimes translating directly and sometimes creating entirely new names that captured the essence of the original. Hitokage became Charmander, Fushigidon became Bulbasaur, and Zenigame became Squirtle. The marketing campaign for Pokémon in North America was ambitious and multifaceted. Nintendo of America understood that they couldn't just release the games and hope for the best. They needed to create buzz and establish Pokémon as a cultural phenomenon from day one. The campaign included television commercials, print ads in gaming magazines, promotional events at toy stores and game retailers, and partnerships with other media properties. The commercials in particular were memorable, featuring real kids discovering Pokémon in their everyday lives, and the tagline "Gotta catch 'em all" being prominently featured. Satoshi Tajiri wanted to recreate the feeling of catching bugs in fields that were disappearing under urban development. He wanted to give a new generation the joy of discovery, collection, and sharing that he had experienced as a child. By that measure, Pokémon has succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. It has given countless children and adults around the world moments of wonder, excitement, and happiness. It has created memories that will last lifetimes and friendships that might never have formed otherwise. It has enriched lives in ways both large and small. And so, as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you might dream of a world filled with mysterious creatures, a world where forests hide rare treasures, where waters conceal legendary beings, and where the sky holds wonders waiting to be discovered. A world where friendship and courage matter more than strength alone. A world where a child can set out on an adventure and change everything. A world where you too can be the very best, like no one ever was. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the entire history of Pokémon, from Game Boy to Game Boy Color, to Game Boy Advance to Nintendo DS, to 3DS to Switch. From 151 Pokémon to over 1,000. From a small Japanese studio's risky bet to the highest-grossing media franchise in history. It's been quite an adventure. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Pokémon's history, I encourage you to like, subscribe, and share your own Pokémon memories in the comments below. What was your first Pokémon game? Who was your starter? What's your favourite generation? Your stories are part of this incredible legacy too. But for now, rest easy. Let the memories of your own Pokémon journeys carry you into sleep. Dream of the adventures still to come, of the Pokémon still waiting to be discovered, and of the joy that this remarkable franchise will continue to bring for generations yet to come. Pokémon Red and Blue were released in North America on September 28, 1998, more than 2 years after the original Japanese launch. By this time, the franchise had expanded significantly in Japan. An anime series had launched in April 1997, telling the story of a young trainer named Ash Ketchum and his partner Pikachu as they journeyed through the Kanto region. The anime was a massive hit, driving even more interest in the games and introducing Pokémon to audiences who might not have been regular gamers. A trading card game had also been released in Japan, adding another dimension to the franchise and giving fans a new way to collect and battle with their favourite creatures. When Pokémon arrived in North America, it brought this expanded universe with it. The anime began airing on American television, dubbed into English, just days after the games launched. The timing was perfect. Children who were intrigued by the games could watch the anime to learn more about the world and characters. Those who discovered Pokémon through the cartoon were driven to seek out the games, to experience the adventure for themselves. The two mediums reinforced each other, creating a feedback loop that propelled Pokémon to unprecedented heights of popularity. The response to Pokémon in North America exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Within weeks of release, the games were selling out across the country. Retailers struggled to keep up with demand as Pokémon rapidly became the must-have title for the Game Boy. By the end of 1998, Pokémon had become a genuine cultural phenomenon in the United States, with children, teenagers, and even adults getting caught up in the collecting and battling craze. The phrase Pokémon became part of everyday vocabulary, and the creatures themselves became instantly recognizable icons. The success wasn't limited to the games. The Pokémon trading card game launched in North America in January 1999, and it became an instant sensation. Card shops and toy stores couldn't keep booster packs on shelves. The cards became valuable collectibles, with rare holographic cards fetching significant prices on secondary markets. The combination of the video games, anime, and trading cards created a multimedia empire that touched every aspect of children's entertainment. Pokémon was no longer just a game, it was a lifestyle. In Europe and other international markets, Pokémon followed a similar trajectory. The games launched across Europe throughout 1999, accompanied by the anime and trading cards. Each new region embraced Pokémon enthusiastically, with the franchise transcending language and cultural barriers to become a truly global phenomenon. By the end of 1999, Pokémon had sold over 40 million games worldwide, making it one of the best-selling video game franchises of all time after just 3 years on the market. The original 151 Pokémon became cultural icons in their own right. Pikachu, the electric mouse that served as Ash's partner in the anime, became the face of the franchise and one of the most recognizable characters in popular culture. But beyond Pikachu, creatures like Charizard, Mewtwo, Blastoise, and Eevee captured the imaginations of millions. Each Pokémon had its own personality, design, and appeal, and fans developed deep attachments to their favorites. The diversity of the creature designs ensured that there was something for everyone, whether you preferred cute Pokémon like Jigglypuff, cool ones like Gyarados, or mysterious legends like Articuno. The battle system of Generation 1, while beloved, was not without its flaws. The game had numerous bugs and glitches, some of which became famous in their own right. The Missing No glitch, which allowed players to encounter a glitched Pokémon and duplicate items, became legendary among fans. Certain moves and abilities didn't work as intended, and the type match-up system had some odd quirks. Psychic-type Pokémon, for example, were overpowered due to having few effective counters and a bug that made them immune to Ghost-type moves, even though Ghost was supposed to be their weakness. Despite these technical issues, the core gameplay was so compelling that players overlooked the rough edges. The story of Generation Y was simple but effective. Players began their journey in Pallet Town, receiving their first Pokémon from Professor Oak and setting out to become a Pokémon master. Along the way, they encountered a rival, also from Pallet Town, who served as a recurring challenge throughout the adventure. The player's journey took them through forests, caves, cities, and waterways, battling gym leaders to earn badges and eventually challenging the Elite Four. Interwoven with this personal quest was a conflict with Team Rocket, a criminal organization seeking to exploit Pokémon for profit and power. The narrative was never overly complex, but it provided context and motivation for the player's actions, giving the adventure a sense of purpose beyond simply collecting creatures. One of the most innovative aspects of Generation Y was the way it handled difficulty and progression. The game gently guided players through the early stages, teaching them the basic mechanics of catching and battling Pokémon through tutorials and helpful NPCs. As players progressed, the challenges increased organically. Gym leaders became tougher, requiring more strategic thinking and careful team composition. Wild Pokémon grew stronger, and opposing trainers used more sophisticated tactics. By the time players reached the Elite Four, they needed a well-balanced team, an understanding of type matchups, and plenty of healing items to succeed. This gradual increase in difficulty kept the game accessible to newcomers while still providing challenge for experienced players. The social aspect of Pokémon cannot be overstated in understanding its success. Trading was not just a side feature, it was central to the entire experience. Completing the Pokédex required trading with other players, as certain Pokémon were exclusive to each version. Beyond this mechanical necessity, trading became a social ritual. Children would bring their Game Boys to school, meet up with friends specifically to trade, and negotiate over which Pokémon they were willing to part with. This social dimension transformed Pokémon from a solitary gaming experience into a shared cultural activity, creating communities of players who helped each other, competed against each other, and bonded over their love of the game. The impact of Generation 1 on the gaming industry was profound and lasting. Pokémon demonstrated that handheld gaming could be just as commercially successful and culturally significant as console gaming. It showed that games built around collecting and socializing could resonate with mainstream audiences in ways that traditional action or adventure games couldn't. And it proved that a well-executed multimedia strategy could amplify a game's success exponentially. The lessons learned from Pokémon's success would influence not just Nintendo's future strategies, but the entire gaming industry's approach to franchise building and transmedia storytelling. By the time Generation 1 concluded, Pokémon had transformed from a risky bet on aging hardware into the most successful new gaming franchise of the 1990s. Satoshi Tajiri's dream of recreating the joy of catching bugs had not just succeeded, it had created something that touched the lives of millions of children around the world. The question now was whether Pokémon could sustain this incredible momentum. Could Game Freak create a worthy follow-up that would build on the first-generation success without losing what made it special? The answer would come with Generation 2. Following the unprecedented success of Generation 1, expectations for the next Pokémon games were sky high. Game Freak faced an enormous challenge. How do you follow up one of the most successful video game launches in history? How do you innovate while preserving what made the original game special? And how do you satisfy a fan base that had grown to tens of millions of players worldwide, all eagerly waiting to see what would come next? The development of Generation 2 was shaped by these questions, and the answers would define Pokémon's future for decades to come. Work on the next generation of Pokémon games began while the original titles were still spreading across the globe. Game Freak knew they had to deliver something that felt both familiar and fresh. They needed to expand the Pokémon universe while maintaining the core gameplay that players loved. The decision was made early on to create a direct sequel to Red and Blue, set in a new region called Johto, but with connections to the original Kanto region. This approach would allow longtime fans to revisit familiar locations while also exploring entirely new areas, creating a bridge between generations. The technical platform for Generation 2 was the Game Boy Color, Nintendo's updated version of the original Game Boy that added color graphics, while maintaining backward compatibility with older Game Boy games. This new hardware gave Game Freak significantly more capabilities to work with. They could create richer, more vibrant visuals, add more complex mechanics, and include features that were impossible on the original hardware. The challenge was to take advantage of these new capabilities while ensuring that the games would still run on original Game Boy systems, since millions of players still owned the older hardware. Satoshi Tajiri and his team at Game Freak decided to introduce 100 new Pokémon with Generation 2, bringing the total count to 251. This number was carefully chosen. It was substantial enough to feel like a major expansion, giving players many new creatures to discover and collect, but not so overwhelming that it would eclipse the original 151 Pokémon that fans had come to love. Each new creature was designed with the same care and attention that had gone into the first generation, with Ken Sugimori once again leading the design process. One of the most significant additions to Generation 2 was the introduction of two new Pokémon types, Dark and Steel. These new types were added to address balance issues from Generation 1, particularly the dominance of Psychic-type Pokémon. Dark-type moves were super effective against Psychic types, finally giving players a reliable way to counter them. Steel types, meanwhile, added a new defensive option with resistance to many common attack types. The addition of these types didn't just balance the game, it fundamentally expanded the strategic depth of battles, creating new team-building possibilities and requiring players to reconsider their strategies. Another major innovation was the introduction of held items. In Generation 1, items existed solely in the player's inventory, used manually during or outside of battle. Generation 2 allowed Pokémon themselves to hold items, which would provide passive benefits or trigger under specific conditions. A Pokémon holding a leftovers item would gradually recover health during battle. One holding a charcoal item would deal increased damage with fire-type moves. These held items added another layer of customization and strategy, allowing players to fine-tune their teams in ways that went far beyond simply choosing which Pokémon to use. Breeding was perhaps the most revolutionary feature introduced in Generation 2. For the first time, players could leave two compatible Pokémon at a daycare center, and they would produce an egg containing a new Pokémon. This mechanic opened up entirely new dimensions of gameplay. Players could now obtain Pokémon that were otherwise difficult to find. They could breed Pokémon to pass down specific moves through a system called egg moves. And most importantly, they could start to think about the individual stats and characteristics of their Pokémon at a deeper level. This last point would eventually evolve into the competitive Pokémon scene, where players breed and train Pokémon with optimal stats for high-level battles, but even casual players enjoyed the simple satisfaction of hatching eggs and discovering what was inside. The introduction of Pokémon genders was intrinsically tied to the breeding system. In Generation 1, Pokémon were genderless entities. In Generation 2, Most Pokémon species were designated as either male or female, with some species having skewed gender ratios and a few remaining genderless. This change made the Pokémon world feel more alive and natural. It also added complexity to collecting, as some evolved forms were gender-specific, requiring players to catch and evolve both male and female versions of certain species. Time became a meaningful concept in Generation 2 through the introduction of a day-night cycle. The game featured a real-time clock that tracked the actual time of day, and the Pokémon world changed accordingly. Different Pokémon appeared during the day versus at night. NPCs had different dialogue depending on the time. Certain events could only be triggered during specific hours. Days of the week also mattered, with some Pokémon and events only available on particular days. This temporal dimension made the world feel more dynamic and encouraged players to revisit areas at different times to see what had changed. The Johto region was designed to feel distinct from Kanto, while still fitting within the same universe. Inspired by the Kansai region of Japan, Johto had a more traditional aesthetic compared to Kanto's modern feel. The region featured traditional Japanese architecture, peaceful towns surrounded by nature, and routes that wound through forests and mountains. The gym leaders of Johto each specialized in a specific type, just like in Kanto, but they were designed with distinct personalities and challenges that set them apart from their predecessors. The story of Gold and Silver built upon the foundation of the first generation while introducing new elements. Players once again began as a young trainer, this time setting out from New Bark Town in Johto. The basic structure was similar: travel the region, defeat gym leaders, and challenge the Elite Four. But Generation 2 added complexity to this formula. The legendary Pokémon of Yoto, Lugia, and Ho-Oh were woven into the region's lore and history. Team Rocket, disbanded after their defeat in Kanto, attempted to make a comeback in Johto, giving players a recurring antagonist. And the relationship between the player and their rival was more nuanced, with the rival starting as a thief, but gradually evolving throughout the story. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of Gold and Silver was the post-game content. After defeating the Elite Four and becoming the champion of Johto, players discovered that their journey was far from over. Through a series of events, players gained access to the Kanto region, the setting of the first-generation games. Kanto was not just a brief revisit. It was a fully explorable region, with all 8 original gym leaders available to challenge. This effectively meant that Gold and Silver contained 2 full regions worth of content, an unprecedented amount of gameplay for a handheld title at the time. The inclusion of Kanto served multiple purposes. For players who had experienced Red and Blue, it was a nostalgic journey through familiar locations, now updated with Generation 2's improved graphics and mechanics. They could see how Kanto had changed in the 3 years that had passed between the stories of the 2 generations. For new players who hadn't experienced Generation 1, it was an introduction to the series' roots, and a chance to see where Pokémon began. And for everyone, it represented incredible value, essentially offering 2 adventures for the price of 1. The final challenge of Gold and Silver was a battle that became legendary among Pokémon fans. After conquering both the Johto and Kanto regions, players could climb Mount Silver, a treacherous mountain with high-level wild Pokémon. At the summit, they would encounter Red, the silent protagonist of Generation 1, standing alone in the snow. Red had the highest level team of any trainer in the game, and battling him represented the ultimate test of a player's skills and preparation. Defeating Red gave a sense of closure, connecting the 2 generations and demonstrating how far the player had come. Pokémon Gold and Silver were released in Japan on November 23rd, 1999, roughly 3.5 years after Red and Green. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The game sold over 6 million copies in Japan alone within their first week of release, shattering previous records and demonstrating that Pokémon's popularity was not a temporary fad but a sustained phenomenon. Players were delighted by the new Pokémon, enchanted by the breeding system, and amazed by the scope of the adventure. The day-night cycle and real-time clock made the game feel alive in a way that previous titles couldn't match. The international release came on October 15, 2000 for North America and April 6, 2001 for Europe. By this time, Pokémon had been an established force in Western markets for over 2 years, and anticipation for the new games was intense. Nintendo and Game Freak delivered a marketing campaign that built on the success of the first generation while highlighting the innovations of the second. The phrase, "Gotta catch 'em all," was joined by promotions emphasizing the new Pokémon, the expanded world, and the ability to return to Kanto. Western fans embraced Generation 2 just as enthusiastically as their Japanese counterparts. Gold and Silver quickly became bestsellers, moving millions of copies in their first months on store shelves. The anime had continued to air throughout 1999 and 2000, introducing Johto Pokémon to audiences before the games even released. This created a situation where viewers were already familiar with creatures like Togepi, Marill and Snubbull before they could catch them in the games, building anticipation and making the eventual release even more satisfying. In December 2000, shortly after the North American release of Gold and Silver, Game Freak released Pokémon Crystal in Japan. Crystal was an enhanced version of Gold and Silver, similar to how Yellow had been an enhanced version of Red and Blue. Crystal. The entire history of Pokémon script. Part 2 introduced several refinements and additions that made it the definitive way to experience the Johto region. Most notably, Crystal added the Battle Tower, a facility where players could test their skills in consecutive battles against increasingly difficult opponents. This was the first major competitive feature in Pokémon, planting seeds for what would eventually become a robust competitive battling scene. Crystal also introduced animated sprites for Pokémon during battles. While the animations were simple, they added life and personality to each creature. The game allowed players to choose their character's gender for the first time, a seemingly small feature that nonetheless made the experience feel more personal and inclusive. And Crystal featured Suicune, one of the legendary dogs of Johto, more prominently in the story, giving players more opportunities to encounter and capture this elegant creature. The Generation 2 era established patterns that would define Pokémon for years to come. The 3-version release cycle, starting with 2 paired games followed by an enhanced 3rd version, became a standard practice. The balance between innovation and tradition, introducing new features while preserving core gameplay, became a guiding principle, and the approach of building each generation on the foundations of previous ones, maintaining compatibility and continuity, helped create a sense of shared history and progression that deepened player investment in the franchise. By the time Generation 2 concluded in 2002, Pokémon had evolved from a phenomenon into an institution. The franchise had proven it could successfully iterate and expand without losing its identity. The games had sold over 70 million copies worldwide across all versions, cementing Pokémon's position as one of Nintendo's most valuable properties. More importantly, the fan community had grown and matured, with players developing deeper connections to the series and beginning to engage with it on more sophisticated levels. The stage was set for Generation 3 and a new chapter in Pokémon's history. As the new millennium began, Nintendo was preparing to launch its next handheld console, the Game Boy Advance. This system represented a significant technological leap over the Game Boy Color, featuring a 32-bit processor, a larger color screen, and substantially more processing power and memory. For Game Freak, the Game Boy Advance presented both exciting opportunities and significant challenges. They could create Pokémon games with richer graphics, more complex systems, and larger worlds than ever before. But the transition to new hardware also meant making difficult decisions about backward compatibility and continuity with previous generations. The decision that would define Generation 3 and prove controversial among fans was the choice to create a clean break from Generations 1 and 2. Due to hardware differences between the Game Boy Advance and previous systems, along with a desire to rebuild the game engine from the ground up to take full advantage of the new hardware, Game Freak determined that direct trading between Generation 3 and earlier generations would not be possible. This meant that players could not transfer their beloved Pokémon from Gold, Silver, or Crystal to the new games. For many fans, particularly those who had spent years building collections and training their favourite creatures, this was a devastating blow. Game Freak understood the controversy this decision would cause, and they didn't make it lightly. However, they believed that starting fresh would allow them to build Generation 3 with a stronger technical foundation that could support the series for years to come. They could redesign core systems, implement new mechanics, and create a more polished experience without being constrained by the need to maintain compatibility with 6-year-old code. The hope was that the quality of the new games would ultimately justify the sacrifice of backward compatibility. The setting for Generation 3 was the Hoenn region, inspired by the island of Kyushu in southwestern Japan. Hoenn was designed to feel distinctly different from both Kanto and Johto. It featured a tropical climate, extensive water routes, and a landscape dominated by the conflict between land and sea. The region's geography included volcanic areas, rainforests, deserts, and island chains, creating a diverse environment for players to explore. The visual presentation of Hoenn took full advantage of the Game Boy Advance's capabilities, with more detailed sprites, richer colours, and more complex environments than previous games. Generation 3 introduced 135 new Pokémon, bringing the total count to 386. The new creatures reflected Hoenn's tropical setting, with many water-type Pokémon, bug types found in lush forests, and rock types dwelling in volcanic regions. Ken Sugimori's designs for Generation 3 showed the evolution of his artistic style, with creatures that were often more detailed and elaborate than those from earlier generations. Some designs, like Blaziken and Gardevoir, became instant favourites. Others, like Castform and Kecleon, introduced unique gimmicks and abilities that set them apart. The battle system received significant refinements in Generation 3. The most important change was the restructuring of Pokémon stats and how they were calculated internally. Game Freak introduced concepts called individual values and effort values, which determined the specific stats of individual Pokémon beyond their base species stats. This created much more variation between different Pokémon of the same species, making each creature feel more unique. These hidden stats would become crucial for competitive battling, though most casual players never needed to understand them deeply to enjoy the games. Abilities were introduced as a new feature in Generation 3, and they fundamentally changed battle strategy. Each Pokémon species was assigned one or two possible abilities, passive effects that would activate during battle under specific conditions. Intimidate lowered the opponent's attack stat when the Pokémon entered battle. Sturdy prevented one-hit knockout moves from working. Drizzle automatically caused rain to fall, boosting water-type moves. These abilities added another dimension to team building and battle strategy, Players had to consider not just a Pokémon's type, stats, and moves, but also how its ability would interact with the rest of their team and the opponent's strategy. Natures were another new mechanic that added depth to Pokémon training. Each individual Pokémon was assigned one of 25 possible natures, which would slightly boost one stat while slightly reducing another. A Pokémon with a jolly nature would have increased speed but decreased special attack. An adamant nature boosted attack while reducing special attack. Natures gave players yet another way to customize their Pokémon, allowing them to emphasize the strengths they wanted to focus on for each creature. Double battles were introduced as a new battle format in Generation 3. Instead of the traditional one-on-one format, double battles had two Pokémon from each side on the field simultaneously. This created entirely new strategic considerations. Moves could hit multiple targets or support teammates. Abilities and stat changes affected multiple Pokémon. Team composition needed to consider synergy between partners, not just individual strength. While double battles were optional in the main story, they would eventually become the standard format for competitive Pokémon tournaments. The story of Ruby and Sapphire revolved around two villainous teams with opposing goals, Team Magma and Team Aqua. Team Magma sought to expand the landmass of Hoenn by awakening the legendary Pokémon Groudon, which embodied the power of land and volcanoes. Team Aqua wanted to expand the seas by awakening Kyogre, which controlled the oceans and rain. The player's version determined which team was the primary antagonist, with Ruby featuring Team Magma and Sapphire featuring Team Aqua as the main threat. This dual-team approach gave the two versions more significant differences than just the available Pokémon. The conflict between Team Magma and Aqua culminated in one of the teams successfully awakening their legendary Pokémon, causing an environmental catastrophe that threatened all of Hoenn. Players had to awaken the opposite legendary to restore balance, then capture the ancient Pokémon Rayquaza to fully resolve the crisis. This story was more ambitious and apocalyptic than those of previous generations, with higher stakes and more dramatic moments. It showed Game Freak's growing confidence in their storytelling abilities and their willingness to explore more complex narratives. Pokémon contests were introduced as a side activity that offered an alternative to battling. In contests, Pokémon would perform before judges and audiences, showing off their moves in categories like beauty, coolness, toughness, cleverness, and cuteness. Moves were evaluated not on their combat effectiveness, but on their visual appeal and how they matched the contest category. Players could dress up their Pokémon with accessories and feed them special berries called Pokéblocks to enhance their contest stats. Contests provided a non-violent way to engage with Pokémon, appealing to players who were more interested in the collecting and social aspects of the franchise than competitive battling. The secret base feature allowed players to create their own personal spaces within Hoenn. By teaching a Pokémon specific moves, players could create bases in special locations throughout the region. They could decorate these bases with furniture and items, then share them with friends. When visiting another player's secret base, you could battle a team of that player's Pokémon controlled by AI. Secret bases were a charming addition that encouraged creativity and social interaction, giving players a way to express themselves within the game world. Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire were released in Japan on November 21, 2002, exactly 3 years after Gold and Silver. The game sold well, moving over 5 million copies in Japan within the first few months. However, the reception was more mixed than it had been for previous generations. While many players appreciated the graphical improvements, new mechanics, and expanded world, others were upset about the lack of backward compatibility. The inability to transfer Pokémon from earlier generations combined with the fact that many Generation Y and 2 Pokémon couldn't be caught in Hoenn at all, led to significant criticism from the fan base. The international release came on March 19, 2003 for North America and July 25, 2003 for Europe. Nintendo's marketing emphasized the new features and the Game Boy Advance's capabilities, attempting to frame Generation 3 as a fresh start and exciting evolution for the series. Sales were strong, with Ruby and Sapphire becoming among the best-selling Game Boy Advance titles. However, the debate about compatibility continued to simmer within the fan community. To address some of the concerns about the limited Pokémon roster, Game Freak released 2 special games for the GameCube, Pokémon Colosseum in 2003 and Pokémon XD, Gale of Darkness in 2005. These games, developed in collaboration with Genius Sonority, allowed players to catch certain Pokémon from previous generations that weren't available in Ruby and Sapphire, then transfer them to their Game Boy Advance games. While these titles helped somewhat, they required owning a GameCube and special connectivity cables, making them inaccessible to many players. The real solution came with the release of Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green in Japan on January 29, 2004, and internationally in September 2004. These games were remakes of the original Red and Green versions, completely rebuilt using the Generation 3 engine. Fire Red and Leaf Green featured the same story and region as the originals, but with updated graphics, the new battle system, and additional post-game content. Most importantly, they included all the Generation 1 Pokémon, allowing players to catch and transfer them to Ruby and Sapphire. The remakes were both a love letter to longtime fans and a way for newcomers to experience the beginning of Pokémon's story with modern gameplay. Fire Red and Leaf Green demonstrated an approach that would become important for future generations. Remakes could bring back beloved regions and Pokémon, while also introducing quality-of-life improvements and new features. The games were critically and commercially successful, selling over 12 million copies worldwide, and rekindling nostalgia for many players who had grown up with the original games. In September 2004 in Japan and March 2005 internationally, Game Freak released Pokémon Emerald, the enhanced third version of Ruby and Sapphire. Emerald combined elements from both versions, allowing players to encounter both Team Magma and Team Aqua, and catch both Groudon and Kyogre. The game introduced the Battle Frontier, an expanded version of Crystal's Battle Tower that featured 7 different battle facilities, each with unique rules and challenges. The Battle Frontier became a major draw for competitive players, offering some of the most difficult challenges in any Pokémon game, and requiring deep understanding of battle mechanics to succeed. Emerald also refined many aspects of Ruby and Sapphire, improving the pacing of the story, adjusting gym leader teams, and adding small quality-of-life features. It represented the culmination of Generation 3's vision, bringing together all the innovations and lessons learned over the generation's lifespan into one definitive package. Despite the initial controversy, Generation 3 ultimately succeeded in its goals. The clean break from previous generations, while painful at the time, allowed Game Freak to build a stronger foundation for future games. The introduction of abilities, natures, and the reformed state system added strategic depth that would support competitive Pokémon for decades to come. The graphical and audio improvements showcased what Pokémon could achieve on more powerful hardware. And the successful Fire Red and Leaf Green remakes established a template for bringing back classic content in future generations. By the time Generation 3 concluded in 2006, the series had weathered its first major controversy and emerged stronger. The games had sold over 35 million copies across all versions, maintaining Pokemon's position as a commercial powerhouse. More importantly, the technical and mechanical foundations established in Generation 3 would prove valuable as the series moved forward into even more ambitious territory with the Nintendo DS. The Nintendo DS represented a radical departure from previous Nintendo handhelds. With two screens, one of them a touchscreen, wireless connectivity, improved graphics capabilities, and a built-in microphone, the DS opened up possibilities that would have been unthinkable on earlier hardware. For Game Freak, the DS presented an opportunity to push Pokémon in new directions, while also addressing lingering issues from Generation 3. The development of Generation 4 would be guided by two main goals: innovate using the DS's unique features and restore the sense of continuity that had been broken with Generation 3's clean break. The most significant decision made for Generation 4 was the commitment to full compatibility with Generation 3. Players would be able to transfer their Pokémon from Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, Fire Red, and Leaf Green to the new games through a feature called PAL Park. This required inserting a Game Boy Advance cartridge into the DS's GBA slot, then participating in a special catching minigame to move Pokémon over. While not as seamless as direct trading, PAL Park restored the ability to bring forward beloved Pokémon from previous generations, healing one of the biggest wounds from Generation 3. The setting for Generation 4 was the Sinnoh region, based on the island of Hokkaido in northern Japan. Sinnoh was designed with a more mythological and mysterious atmosphere than previous regions. The landscape featured snow-covered mountains, ancient ruins, and a general sense of grandeur and antiquity. The region's design took advantage of the DS's increased power, with more detailed environments, weather effects, and a greater sense of scale than had been possible on the Game Boy Advance. Generation 4 introduced 107 new Pokémon, bringing the total to 493. Unlike Generation 3, which had limited the availability of older Pokémon, Sinnoh was populated with creatures from all previous generations alongside the new additions. This meant that players could catch beloved Pokémon from Generations 1-2 that had been absent from Ruby and Sapphire. The new Pokémon themselves were notable for including many evolutions of creatures from earlier generations. Electivire, Magmortar, and Tangrowth were evolutions of Generation 1 Pokémon. Weevil, Gliscor, and Mamoswine evolved from Generation 2 Pokémon. These cross-generational evolutions helped tie the generations together and gave older Pokémon new relevance. The battle system received its most significant overhaul since Generation 3. The most important change was the physical special split. In previous generations, whether a move was physical or special was determined solely by its type. All fire-type moves were special, all fighting-type moves were physical, and so on. Generation 4 changed this so that each individual move was designated as physical or special, based on its actual characteristics. This split fundamentally altered team building and battle strategy. Pokémon that had been limited by their type's traditional role could now be used in new ways. A Weevil with high attack could finally use powerful physical dark-type moves. A Gengar with high special attack could use special category ghost moves effectively. The Wi-Fi Club were introduced, allowing players to battle and trade with others around the world wirelessly. This was revolutionary. Previous generations had required link cables or being in close physical proximity to trade. Now players could connect with trainers on different continents, vastly expanding the social dimension of Pokémon. The Global Trade Station, or GTS, took this further by allowing players to deposit a Pokémon for trade and specify what they wanted in return. Other players anywhere in the world could browse these offers and complete trades even when the original trainer wasn't online. The GTS made completing the Pokédex more accessible than ever before. The story of Diamond and Pearl was the most ambitious and mythologically complex that Pokémon had attempted to that point. The villain was Cyrus, the leader of Team Galactic, an organization whose stated goal was to create a new universe where Cyrus could rule as a god. Cyrus sought to capture the legendary Pokémon Dialga and Palkia, which controlled time and space respectively, and used their power to destroy the current universe and create his ideal world. This was a far more philosophical and existential threat than previous villains had posed. The story delved into questions about the nature of reality, the relationship between emotions and meaning, and what it means to seek a perfect world. The Lake Guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, played a crucial role in the story. These three legendary Pokémon represented knowledge, emotion, and willpower respectively, and were said to have taught these concepts to humanity in ancient times. Cyrus despised emotion and spirit, viewing them as sources of conflict and imperfection, and sought to create a world without them. The player, with the help of the Lake Guardians and the region's champion Cynthia, had to stop Cyrus's plan before he could complete his apocalyptic vision. The post-game of Diamond and Pearl was substantial, though not as extensive as Gold and Silver's return to Kanto. Players could access new areas, challenge stronger trainers, and pursue legendary Pokémon that hadn't appeared during the main story. The Battle Tower returned, offering competitive challenges for skilled players, and crucially, the ability to transfer Pokémon from Generation 3 meant that players could work toward completing a national Pokédex that included all 493 Pokémon across 4 generations. Pokémon Diamond and Pearl were released in Japan on September 28, 2006, and in North America on April 22, 2007. The response was enthusiastic. Fans appreciated the return of older Pokémon, the online features, and the refinements to the battle system. The game sold exceptionally well, moving over 4 million copies in Japan and millions more internationally. The technological showcase of the DS hardware impressed players, with improved 3D graphics for environments and more dynamic camera angles during important story moments. In September 2008 in Japan and March 2009 internationally, Game Freak released Pokémon Platinum, the enhanced version of Diamond and Pearl. Platinum made numerous improvements to the base games, including a significantly expanded and improved story. Giratina, a third legendary Pokémon alongside Dialga and Palkia, received a much more prominent role. Giratina represented antimatter and dwelled in the distortion world, a bizarre alternate dimension with twisted gravity and surreal geometry. The distortion world was one of the most visually striking and memorable locations in any Pokémon game, taking full advantage of the DS's capabilities to create an environment that felt genuinely alien and unsettling. Platinum refined the pacing of the adventure, adjusted the regional Pokédex to make more Pokémon available earlier, and improved various quality-of-life aspects. The Battle Frontier from Emerald returned with all 7 facilities, providing extensive post-game content for competitive players. Platinum represented Game Freak's growing mastery of creating definitive enhanced versions that significantly improved upon their base games. One of the most significant releases of Generation 4 came in March 2009 in Japan and March 2010 internationally. Pokémon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. These were remakes of Gold and Silver, completely rebuilt using the Generation 4 engine. The remakes were incredibly faithful to the originals, while adding modern features and quality-of-life improvements. All the beloved features of Generation 2 returned. The day-night cycle, Pokémon following the player in the overworld, the Pokéathlon mini-games, and of course the ability to visit both Johto and Kanto. Heart Gold and Soul Silver went beyond simple remakes by adding substantial new content. The games came with a Pokewalker, a pedometer device that players could transfer a Pokémon to, then carry around in real life. Steps taken on the Pokewalker would earn points that could be used to catch wild Pokémon or find items, then transferred back to the main game. This was an early example of Pokémon incorporating real-world activity into gameplay, foreshadowing later developments like Pokémon Go. The remakes also expanded on the story of the original games, adding more character development for the rival, and giving greater prominence to the legendary Pokémon Ho-Oh and Lugia. The post-game content was extensive, including the Battle Frontier and the ability to battle Red atop Mount Silver, just as in the originals. Heart Gold and Soul Silver were both critical and commercial triumphs, selling over 12 million copies worldwide and being hailed as perhaps the best Pokémon games ever made by many fans and critics. Generation 4 represented a maturation of the Pokémon formula. The physical special split created a battle system that would remain largely unchanged for over a decade. The online features established how Pokémon would handle connectivity in the modern era. The successful remakes showed that Game Freak could revisit classic regions and stories in ways that honoured the originals while bringing them up to contemporary standards. And the more complex storytelling demonstrated that Pokémon could tackle deeper themes without losing its essential charm and accessibility. By 2010, when Generation 4 concluded, Pokémon had been a dominant force in gaming for over a decade. The series had weathered the transition to new hardware multiple times, maintained its commercial success through changing market conditions, and continued to evolve while staying true to its core identity. Generation FE's games had sold over 50 million copies across all versions, cementing the DS era as one of Pokémon's most successful periods. The franchise was now truly a multi-generational phenomenon, with parents who had grown up with Red and Blue now introducing their children to Pokémon through Diamond, Pearl and Platinum. Following the massive success of Generation 4, Game Freak faced a question that would define Generation 5. Should they play it safe and iterate on a proven formula, or take risks and try something genuinely new? Under the direction of Junichi Masuda, who had been involved with Pokémon since the very beginning, the decision was made to pursue the latter path. Generation VEB would be the most experimental and ambitious set of Pokémon games yet, with changes that touched nearly every aspect of the formula that had been established over the previous 4 generations. The most radical decision was the composition of the regional Pokédex. In every previous generation, the regional Pokédex had included a mix of new Pokémon and creatures from earlier generations. Generation V broke this tradition completely. The Unova region's Pokédex contained only new Pokémon until players defeated the Elite Four and unlocked the postgame. This meant that for the entire main story, players would encounter nothing but creatures they had never seen before. It was a bold attempt to recreate the sense of discovery and wonder that longtime fans had experienced way back in 1996, when everything was new. To make this approach work, Game Freak introduced an unprecedented 156 new Pokémon, the largest addition in any single generation. These designs were carefully crafted to fill ecological and gameplay niches similar to Pokémon from earlier generations while still being distinct. Roggenrola, Boldore, and Gigalith functioned similarly to the Geodude line but had their own identity. Woobat and Swoobat occupied the same role as Zubat and Golbat. Timburr, Gurdurr, and Conkeldurr paralleled the Machop line. This approach ensured that players would have the types of team members they were accustomed to, while experiencing an entirely new cast of creatures. The Unova region represented a dramatic departure from previous settings. Unlike the Japanese-inspired regions of Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and Sinnoh, Unova was based on New York City and the greater New York metropolitan area. This was the first time Pokémon had drawn inspiration from a location outside of Japan for its main region. Unova's design reflected its inspiration, with large cities, urban environments, bridges connecting different areas, and a general sense of modernity and diversity that set it apart from earlier regions. The visual presentation of Black and White showcased the DS hardware's capabilities more fully than any previous Pokémon game. The graphics featured more detailed environments, dynamic camera angles that would shift during gameplay, and seasons that changed the appearance of the world and affected which Pokémon could be found. The game ran at a higher frame rate during battles, making animations smoother and more dynamic. Bridges would render with convincing perspective as players crossed them. Cities featured multiple levels and more complex layouts than had been possible in earlier games. The battle system received quality-of-life improvements that streamlined the experience. TMs, the items that taught Pokémon new moves, became reusable. In all previous generations, TMs could only be used once, which made players hesitant to use them on Pokémon they weren't certain they would keep on their team. Making TM's infinite use removed this frustration and encouraged experimentation. Experience point distribution was rebalanced so that lower-level Pokémon would gain more experience from battles, while higher-level Pokémon would gain less, helping to keep teams relatively balanced without excessive grinding. Triple battles and rotation battles were introduced as new battle formats. Triple battles had 3 Pokémon from each side on the field simultaneously, with positioning mattering as Pokémon on the left and right couldn't directly attack each other with most moves. Rotation battles also had 3 Pokémon per side, but only one was active at a time, with the ability to instantly rotate to a different Pokémon without using up a turn. These formats added even more variety to battles, though they remained optional and never became as prominent as double battles in competitive play. The story of Black and White was the most sophisticated and morally complex narrative that Pokémon had attempted. The primary antagonist was N, a young man who could understand Pokémon speech and believed that Pokémon and humans should be separated because the practice of training Pokémon was a form of exploitation. N was backed by Team Plasma, an organization that publicly advocated for Pokémon liberation, while secretly planning to create a world where only their leader, Getsis, would possess Pokémon, giving him absolute power. What made this story compelling was that N wasn't simply evil. He genuinely believed he was acting in the best interests of Pokémon, and the game forced players to confront uncomfortable questions about the ethics of Pokémon training. Was it right to keep creatures in Pokeballs? Was battling a form of violence? These questions had always lurked beneath the surface of Pokémon, but Black and White brought them to the forefront. The game ultimately affirmed the bond between humans and Pokémon as positive, but it did so by actually engaging with the counter-arguments rather than dismissing them. The climax of Black and White was one of the most dramatic sequences in any Pokémon game. N awakened the legendary dragon Pokémon Reshiram or Zekrom, depending on the version, and used its power to summon his castle up from beneath the Pokémon League, interrupting the player's challenge of the Elite Four. Players were then forced to capture the opposite legendary dragon and use it in a battle against N's dragon. The confrontation was framed as a battle of ideals, with N representing the ideal of liberation and the player representing the ideal of coexistence. After defeating N and seemingly convincing him that his worldview might be flawed, the true villain Getsis revealed himself and his actual plan for domination. The player's final battle was against Getsis, whose team was notably difficult and featured dark, aggressive Pokémon that reflected his cruel nature. Upon his defeat, N departed, leaving the player as champion but with questions about Pokémon ethics lingering in the background. Pokémon Black and White were released in Japan on September 18, 2010, and in North America on March 6, 2011. The response was mixed in a way that no previous mainline Pokémon game had been. Many players, particularly younger ones and those newer to the series, loved the fresh start and the large cast of new Pokémon. They appreciated the improved graphics, the streamlined mechanics, and the more mature storytelling. However, a significant portion of the fanbase, especially long-time players, reacted negatively to the absence of familiar Pokémon during the main story. They felt disconnected from the experience without the creatures they had grown attached to over the years. Critically, Black and White were praised for their ambition and willingness to take risks. Review scores were generally high, with critics appreciating the quality of life improvements and the more substantive narrative. Sales were strong, with the games moving over 15 million copies worldwide. However, sales were notably lower than Diamond and Pearl, suggesting that some portion of the audience had been alienated by the changes or was simply aging out of the franchise. The sequel to Black and White took an unprecedented approach. Rather than creating a single enhanced third version like Platinum or Emerald, Game Freak developed true sequels, Pokémon Black 2 and White 2. Released in Japan in June 2012 and internationally in October 2012, these games took place 2 years after the events of the original Black and White. Players explored a Unova region that had changed over time, with new areas accessible, different gym leaders in some cities, and an evolved Team Plasma that had splintered into factions. Black 2 and White 2 addressed many of the criticisms of the originals. While the early games still featured primarily new Pokémon, older generations were integrated much more quickly into the adventure. The regional Pokédex was expanded to include over 300 Pokémon, providing much more variety in team building. New features like the Pokémon World Tournament, which brought back gym leaders and champions from all previous generations for special battles, created nostalgia and connected Generation Vi to the series' history in meaningful ways. The story of Black 2 and White 2 continued N's arc while introducing new characters and conflicts. The games explored the aftermath of the original game's events, and provided closure to storylines that had been left open. The difficulty had 2 modes, normal and challenge, with challenge mode offering significantly tougher battles that appealed to veteran players. This acknowledgement that different players wanted different levels of challenge showed Game Freak's growing understanding of their diverse audience. Generation 5 represented a period of creative ambition and risk-taking for Pokémon. The decision to focus exclusively on new Pokémon for the main story was divisive but undeniably bold. The improved storytelling and willingness to engage with complex themes showed that Pokémon could mature alongside its aging fanbase without losing its identity. The technical achievements, from the improved graphics to the smoother animations, demonstrated Game Freak's increasing mastery of the DS hardware. However, Generation Vi also revealed tensions within the fan base. Some players wanted innovation and were willing to embrace significant changes. Others wanted the familiar comfort of traditional Pokémon with incremental improvements. Balancing these desires would become an ongoing challenge for Game Freak as the series continued to evolve. By the time Generation 5 concluded in 2013, the Nintendo 3DS had been on the market for 2 years, and speculation about how Pokémon would transition to Nintendo's new handheld was reaching a fever pitch. The Nintendo 3DS represented another significant technological leap for handheld gaming. With full 3D graphics capabilities, stereoscopic 3D display, improved online features, and much more powerful hardware than the DS, the 3DS opened up possibilities that would fundamentally change how Pokémon games looked and played. For Game Freak, the transition to 3DS meant rebuilding the Pokémon engine once again, this time creating fully three-dimensional models for every Pokémon character and environment. This was an enormous undertaking that would define the visual style of Pokémon for years to come. Generation 6, represented by Pokémon X and Pokémon Y, marked the most dramatic visual transformation in the series' history. For the first time, the entire history of Pokémon script, Part 3 Mon, were rendered as three-dimensional models rather than 2D sprites. Every creature from all previous generations received a detailed 3D model with animations for attacking, being hit, fainting, and idling. This transition required Game Freak to essentially recreate over 700 Pokémon from scratch, a monumental task that consumed a significant portion of the development cycle. The decision to move to 3D models was driven by both technical capabilities and long-term strategy. The 3DS could handle full 3D graphics in ways that the DS simply couldn't. But beyond the immediate visual improvement, creating these models as future-proofed assets meant that they could potentially be used in future games and platforms without needing to be recreated each time. This investment in high-quality 3D models would pay dividends for years to come, as these same models with minor refinements would continue to be used through subsequent generations. The Kalos region, the setting for X and Y, was inspired by France, particularly the city of Paris and the broader French countryside. This marked the second time Pokémon had drawn from a location outside Japan, following Unova's New York inspiration. Kalos was designed to showcase the beauty and elegance that Game Freak associated with France. The central city, Lumiose City, was a sprawling metropolis with a massive tower at its centre, clearly inspired by the Eiffel Tower. The region featured diverse environments from coastal towns to mountain villages to forests and caves, all rendered in full 3D for the first time. Generation 6 introduced 72 new Pokémon, the smallest addition since Generation 2. This relatively modest number was likely due to the enormous effort required to create 3D models for all existing Pokémon while also developing new creatures. The new Pokémon reflected Kalos's French inspiration, with designs that often felt more elegant and refined than those from previous generations. Creatures like Sylveon, Greninja, and Aegislash quickly became fan favourites, demonstrating that Game Freak could still create compelling designs even when working with smaller numbers. The most significant mechanical addition of Generation 6 was the introduction of Mega Evolution, a temporary transformation system that allowed certain Pokémon to evolve beyond their final forms during battle. Mega Evolution required the trainer to possess a keystone and the Pokémon to hold a species-specific Mega Stone. When activated during battle, the Pokémon would transform into a more powerful form with changed stats, abilities, and sometimes even types. Mega Evolutions were temporary, lasting only for the duration of the battle, and each trainer could only Mega Evolve one Pokémon per battle. Mega Evolution was controversial within the fan community from the moment it was announced. Supporters appreciated the new strategic dimension it added to battles and the opportunity to give underpowered Pokémon new relevance through powerful megaforms. Critics argued that it was a gimmick that disrupted the elegant simplicity of traditional evolution, and that it gave already powerful Pokémon like Mewtwo and Garchomp unnecessary buffs. Despite the mixed reception, Mega Evolution became a defining feature of Generations 6 and 7, with Game Freak designing dozens of Mega Evolution forms across multiple games. A new type was introduced for the first time since Generation 2, the Fairy type. This addition was made to rebalance the competitive meta, particularly to nerf Dragon-type Pokémon, which had been extremely powerful and popular in previous generations. Fairy-type moves were super effective against Dragon, Fighting, and Dark types, while being weak to Poison and Steel. Fairy-type Pokémon resisted Bug, Fighting, and Dark moves while being weak to Poison and Steel attacks, and immune to Dragon-type moves entirely. Many existing Pokémon from previous generations were retroactively classified as Fairy types, or given Fairy as a secondary type, including beloved creatures like Clefairy, Jigglypuff, and Gardevoir. The battle system saw refinements and quality of life improvements rather than dramatic overhauls. The experience share item was redesigned to affect the entire party simultaneously, making training multiple Pokémon much more convenient. This change was divisive, with some players appreciating the reduced grinding while others felt it made the games too easy. Sky battles and horde encounters were introduced as new battle formats. Sky battles involved only flying-type Pokémon or those with levitate, while horde encounters had the player face 5 wild Pokémon simultaneously, creating challenging scenarios and making certain training strategies more efficient. The story of X and Y centered on the player's journey through Kalos and the threat posed by Team Flare, a criminal organization led by Lysandre. Lysandre believed that the world's resources were finite, and that humanity's endless growth and consumption would eventually lead to scarcity and conflict. His solution was to activate an ancient weapon that would eliminate most life on the planet, leaving only Team Flare and those Lysandre deemed worthy to inherit a beautiful world with abundant resources. The philosophical underpinning was essentially eco-fascism, though the game presented it in a manner appropriate for younger audiences. The legendary Pokémon of Kalos, Xerneas, and Yveltal represented life and death respectively. These creatures were connected to the ancient weapon Lysandre sought to control, with the player needing to capture one of them to prevent catastrophe. The story also incorporated the mysterious Pokémon Zygarde, a serpentine creature said to protect Kalos' ecosystem, though Zygarde's role was relatively minor in X and Y, with hints that its full significance would be revealed later. Pokémon Amy was a new feature that allowed players to interact directly with their Pokémon through the touchscreen. Players could pet their Pokémon, feed them treats, and play mini-games with them. Building affection through Pokémon Amy provided gameplay benefits, including increased experience gain, higher critical hit rates, and the ability to sometimes avoid attacks or survive hits that would otherwise knock them out. While some competitive players viewed these benefits as unwanted interference in battles, many casual players love the opportunity to bond with their Pokémon in a more direct tactile way. Super Training provided a transparent system for Eevee training, the process of optimizing a Pokémon's effort values to maximize specific stats. In previous generations, Eevee training was opaque and required external guides to understand. Super Training made the process visible and accessible through touchscreen minigames where players aimed and shot at balloon targets. This democratization of competitive training mechanics signaled Game Freak's intention to make high-level play more accessible to the average player. Player Search System, or PSS, was Generation 6 online infrastructure. It made connecting with other players for battles, trades, and other activities seamless and intuitive. The bottom screen constantly displayed nearby players and online friends, allowing instant interaction with a single tap. The global trade station returned with improvements, and new features like Wonder Trade allowed players to trade a Pokémon and receive a random Pokémon from another player somewhere in the world. These online features helped maintain the social dimension of Pokémon in an increasingly connected world. Pokémon X and Y were released simultaneously worldwide on October 12, 2013, marking the first time a mainline Pokémon game launched globally on the same day. This simultaneous release was a major shift in strategy for Nintendo and Game Freak, who had traditionally released games in Japan months before other regions. The worldwide launch created a shared global experience, with players around the world discovering new Pokémon and exploring Kalos together. It also reduced the risk of spoilers and leaks that had plagued previous international releases. The response to X and Y was overwhelmingly positive. Critics praised the visual transformation, the streamlined online features, and the return to a more traditional Pokémon structure after Generation V's experiments. The game scored highly in reviews and sold exceptionally well, moving over 16 million copies worldwide and becoming the best-selling 3DS games at the time of their release. The jump to 3D was widely seen as successful, even though the actual stereoscopic 3D effect was only used in certain areas due to performance limitations. However, X and Y were not without criticism. Many players felt the games were too easy, with the revamped experience share and generally low difficulty making it hard to feel challenged. The story, while dealing with weighty themes, was seen as less compelling than Black and White's narrative, and the post-game content was relatively sparse compared to previous generations, with no battle frontier or equivalent facility and a limited amount of extra content after defeating the Elite Four. The expectation was that Game Freak would release a Pokémon Z version that would expand on X and Y's story, particularly developing Zygarde's role and adding more post-game content. However, this third version never materialized. Instead, Generation 6 next releases were remakes of Ruby and Sapphire, Pokémon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, launched in November 2014. These remakes rebuilt the Hoenn region using Generation 6's engine, bringing Mega Evolution and the new fairy type to Generation 3's story, while adding significant new content and features. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire featured an expanded storyline called the Delta Episode, a post-game narrative that involved the player stopping a meteor from colliding with the planet by capturing Rayquaza and mega-evolving it. This episode provided the kind of substantive post-game content that X and Y had lacked. The games also included substantial quality-of-life improvements over the original Ruby and Sapphire, making them widely regarded as superior to the originals in nearly every way. The remakes sold over 14 million copies worldwide, demonstrating continued demand for both new content and reimagined classic experiences. They also completed the task of bringing all previous regions up to the modern generation standards, as all regions from Kanto through Hoenn had now been remade with current graphics and mechanics. This meant that new fans could experience the entire history of Pokémon's regions with relatively consistent gameplay and visuals. Generation 6 represented a period of consolidation and modernization for Pokémon. The jump to 3D was executed successfully, creating a visual template that would carry forward into future generations. The streamlined online features made playing with others more accessible than ever before. Mega Evolution, despite its controversial status among some fans, added a new dimension to battles and gave Game Freak a tool for refreshing older Pokémon. And the successful remakes of Ruby and Sapphire reinforced the value of revisiting classic content with modern sensibilities. By 2016, Pokémon had been a dominant force in gaming for 20 years. The franchise had weathered multiple hardware transitions, adapted to changing market conditions, and maintained its position as one of Nintendo's most valuable properties. Generation 6 had brought Pokémon fully into the modern era of 3D gaming, while preserving the core formula that had made the series successful. As the generation drew to a close and speculation about Generation 7 began, the question was what new innovations Game Freak would introduce, and whether they would continue to evolve the formula or return to a more conservative approach. Generation 7 represented Game Freak's most ambitious attempts to reimagine the Pokémon formula without abandoning its core identity. After the relatively safe approach of Generation 6, which focused on visual modernization while maintaining traditional structures, Sun and Moon would challenge long-established conventions and introduce systems that fundamentally changed how players experienced the Pokémon journey. The development team, led once again by Shigeru Omori as director and Junichi Masuda as producer, aimed to create games that would feel fresh and surprising even to veteran players who had been with the series for 2 decades. The Alola region was inspired by Hawaii, marking the 3rd consecutive generation to draw from a real-world location outside Japan. The tropical archipelago setting was divided into 4 main islands, each with its own unique ecology, culture, and challenges. The island structure allowed Game Freak to create distinct environments and aesthetics for different parts of the region while maintaining geographical coherence. Alola featured lush rainforests, volcanic landscapes, beautiful beaches, and urban areas that reflected Hawaiian culture and architecture, all rendered with improved graphics that pushed the 3DS hardware to its limits. Generation 7 represented Game Freak's most ambitious attempts to reimagine the Pokémon formula without abandoning its core identity. After the relatively safe approach of Generation 6, which focused on visual modernization while maintaining traditional structures, Sun and Moon would challenge long-established conventions and introduce systems that fundamentally changed how players experienced the Pokémon journey. The development team, led once again by Shigeru Omori as director and Junichi Masuda as producer, aimed to create games that would feel fresh and surprising even to veteran players who had been with the series for 2 decades. The Alola region was inspired by Hawaii, marking the 3rd consecutive generation to draw from a real-world location outside Japan. The tropical archipelago setting was divided into 4 main islands, each with its own unique ecology, culture, and challenges. The island structure allowed Game Freak to create distinct environments and aesthetics for different parts of the region while maintaining geographical coherence. Alola featured lush rainforests, volcanic landscapes, beautiful beaches, and urban areas that reflected Hawaiian culture and architecture, all rendered with improved graphics that pushed the 3DS hardware to its limits. The removal of gyms was controversial before the game's release, with longtime fans worried that such a fundamental change would make the games not feel like real Pokémon. However, once players experienced the Island Challenge, most found that it captured the spirit of the gym system while offering more variety and challenge types. Trials could involve puzzles, navigation challenges, or battles with specific restrictions, making each one feel unique in a way that the relatively uniform gym battles rarely did. The totem Pokémon, with their ability to call for help and their stat boosts, provided difficult battles that many players found more challenging than traditional gym leaders. Z-moves were Generation 7's answer to Mega Evolution, a new battle mechanic that allowed any Pokémon to unleash a devastating powered-up attack once per battle. To use a Z-move, trainers needed a Z-ring, and the Pokémon needed to hold a Z-crystal, corresponding to either a specific move or a type. Z-moves came in 2 varieties: universal type-based moves like Gigavolt Havoc for electric types, and signature moves exclusive to specific Pokémon like Pikachu's Catastropica. The mechanic was accompanied by elaborate animations where the trainer performed a physical dance or pose, which added spectacle, but also drew criticism for being time-consuming. Z-moves were designed to be more accessible than Mega Evolution. Every Pokémon could use them, not just select species with Mega forms, which democratized the new mechanic and allowed previously overlooked Pokémon to have moments of power. However, Z-moves were also seen as more limited in strategic depth compared to Mega Evolution, as they were one-time use rather than a transformation that lasted the entire battle. The competitive scene had mixed feelings, with some appreciating the universal accessibility and others preferring Mega Evolution's sustained impact. The story of Sun and Moon was surprisingly dark and emotionally complex for a Pokémon game. The narrative focused heavily on relationships, family trauma, and belonging. The main character was a newcomer to Alola, establishing themselves in a new home. Their friend Lily struggled with an abusive relationship with her mother, Lusamine, the head of the Ether Foundation. Lusamine was obsessed with Ultra Beasts, mysterious creatures from other dimensions, to the point of neglecting and emotionally abusing her children. The story explored themes of parental failure, the search for identity, and finding family among friends rather than blood relations. The Ultra Beasts themselves were a fascinating addition to Pokémon lore. These creatures came from Ultra Space, parallel dimensions with their own ecosystems. Unlike regular Pokémon, Ultra Beasts were designed to look deliberately alien and unsettling, with appearances and designs that broke many conventions of typical Pokémon aesthetics. Some looked like origami creatures, others resembled bizarre geometric constructs, and still others appeared as distorted versions of familiar concepts. Their existence raised questions about what defined a Pokémon and expanded the scope of the Pokémon universe beyond a single world. The climax of the story involved travelling to Ultra Space to rescue Lusamine, who had merged with an Ultra Beast in her obsession. The resolution of the family drama between Lily, her brother Gladion, and their mother was handled with more emotional nuance than most Pokémon stories, though the ending still provided the hopeful resolution typical of the series. After the main story, players could participate in extensive post-game content, involving hunting down and capturing the various Ultra Beasts that had emerged into Alola. Poképelago was a new feature that allowed players to develop small islands where their boxed Pokémon could relax and play. These islands provided passive benefits, such as finding items, growing berries, or even training Pokémon without needing to keep them in the active party. Poképelago exemplified Generation 7's focus on making previously tedious tasks more convenient and engaging. It gave purpose to boxed Pokémon and allowed players to make progress on certain tasks passively. Festival Plaza served as the game's multiplayer hub, replacing the PSS from Generation 6. Players could visit other trainers' plazas, participate in various activities, and access online features for trading and battling. While functional, Festival Plaza was generally seen as a step backward from the PSS, as it required entering a separate area, rather than being instantly accessible from the main game. This cumbersome design was one of the few aspects of Sun and Moon that received consistent criticism. Pokémon Sun and Moon were released worldwide on November 18, 2016, maintaining Generation 6 tradition of simultaneous global launches. The games were met with critical acclaim and strong sales, moving over 16 million copies worldwide. Critics and players praised the willingness to experiment with established formulas, the improved storytelling, and the visual improvements. The Alola region's unique setting and culture were widely appreciated, as were the regional forms and new Pokémon designs. However, Sun and Moon also received criticism for certain design choices. The games featured extensive tutorials and cutscenes, particularly in the early hours, which made replaying the games less appealing. The difficulty was uneven, with some totem Pokémon providing genuine challenges while other parts of the game felt too easy, due to the revamped experience share, and the removal of certain features from previous generations, such as the PSS and Mega Evolution's prominence, disappointed some fans. Rather than creating traditional enhanced versions called Pokémon Stars or Eclipse, Game Freak took a different approach. In November 2017, they released Pokémon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, which were described as alternate versions of the original games rather than simple enhancements. These games featured a significantly altered story, with different plot developments, new characters, and an expanded post-game narrative called the Episode RR that brought back all the villainous team leaders from previous generations. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon added substantial gameplay content, including new Ultra Beasts, more Mega Evolutions, and the ability to travel through Ultra Wormholes to catch legendary Pokémon from previous generations. The games also included refinements to address criticisms of the originals, though the extensive cutscenes remained largely intact. The reception to Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon was more mixed than the originals, with some players appreciating the additional content while others felt the changes weren't substantial enough to justify purchasing what felt like slightly modified versions of games they had played a year earlier. A significant release during Generation 7 was Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee in November 2018. These games were remakes of Pokémon Yellow set in the Kanto region, but designed specifically to bridge the gap between Pokémon Go, the wildly successful mobile game, and the traditional mainline series. Let's Go games featured simplified mechanics, with wild Pokémon encounters working similarly to Pokémon Go's catching system, rather than traditional battles. The games removed random encounters, showing Pokémon walking in the overworld, and allowed players to bring Pokémon from Pokémon Go into the Switch games. Let's Go games were developed for the Nintendo Switch, marking Pokémon's transition to Nintendo's hybrid home portable console. The games featured improved graphics befitting the more powerful hardware, with fully rendered 3D environments and updated character models. They were designed to be accessible entry points for younger players or those coming from Pokémon Go, with streamlined mechanics and reduced complexity compared to the mainline games. The reception to Let's Go was divided along demographic lines. Younger players and those new to traditional Pokémon games generally loved the accessible mechanics and charming presentation. Veteran players had more mixed feelings, with some appreciating the nostalgic return to Kanto and the quality of life improvements like visible Pokémon in the overworld, while others felt the simplified mechanics removed too much of what made Pokémon engaging. Despite the mixed reception from core fans, Let's Go games sold over 14 million copies, demonstrating significant demand for more accessible Pokémon experiences. Generation 7 represented a period of bold experimentation for Pokémon. The removal of gyms, the focus on story and character development, and the willingness to redesign classic Pokémon through regional forms showed Game Freak's confidence in evolving the formula. The generation also saw Pokémon successfully transition to the Nintendo Switch with Let's Go, proving that the franchise could thrive on home console hardware. By the time Generation 7 concluded in 2019, Pokémon was positioned to make its full mainline debut on the Switch, with fans eagerly anticipating what the more powerful hardware would allow. Generation 8 marked Pokémon's full arrival on the Nintendo Switch with mainline entries designed from the ground up for Nintendo's hybrid console. For the first time in the series' history, mainline Pokémon games would be played primarily on television screens in homes rather than on dedicated handheld devices. This transition brought both opportunities and challenges. The Switch's significantly more powerful hardware allowed for better graphics, larger environments, and more complex systems. But it also raised expectations, with players hoping for a visual and gameplay leap comparable to what had been achieved when the series moved from Game Boy to Nintendo DS and then to 3DS. The development of Generation 8 was led by Shigeru Omori, returning from his work on Sun and Moon, with Game Freak facing the considerable challenge of scaling up Pokémon for HD console gaming. The studio had limited experience developing for home consoles, and the Switch represented a significant step up in complexity from the 3DS. These developmental challenges would ultimately impact what features made it into the final games and contribute to some of the controversies that would surround Generation 8's release. The Galar region was inspired by Great Britain, particularly England and Scotland. The region featured rolling countryside, industrial cities, medieval-style towns, and wild areas dotted with ancient ruins. Galar's design incorporated British cultural elements, from football-inspired gym stadiums to punk rock-styled Team Yell members to legendary Pokémon based on British mythology. The region felt cohesive and distinct, with a clear aesthetic identity that set it apart from previous regions. Generation 8 introduced 81 new Pokémon, later expanded to 89 with DLC, along with 13 regional variants of existing Pokémon called Galarian forms. These Galarian forms followed the template established by Alolan forms, reimagining classic Pokémon with new types and designs that reflected their adaptation to Gala's environment. Galarian Weezing gained a fairy typing and smokestacks on its head that purified air. Galarian Farfetch'd became a fighting type and could evolve into Sirfetch'd. Galarian Corsola and its evolution Cursola had a ghost typing, representing coral bleached and killed by environmental damage. The wild area was Generation 8's most significant innovation. This was a large, open environment connecting several parts of Galar where players could freely control the camera and explore in any direction. Different Pokémon appeared depending on weather conditions, which changed daily. The wild area contained max raid battles. Cooperative encounters where up to 4 players battled against a giant Dynamaxed Pokémon for a chance to catch it. The wild area represented Game Freak's first steps toward open-world design, though it existed alongside traditional routes with linear structure. Dynamax and Gigantamax were Generation 8's signature battle mechanics, replacing Mega Evolution and Z moves. Dynamax allowed any Pokémon to temporarily become giant-sized for 3 turns, gaining massively increased HP and transforming their moves into max moves with enhanced effects. Certain species had special Gigantamax forms that changed their appearance when Dynamaxed, and gave them access to a unique G-Max move. Dynamax could only be used in specific locations, primarily during gym battles and max raid battles, limiting its impact on regular gameplay. The gym challenge returned after its absence in Generation 7th, but with significant changes that leaned into Galar's football culture. Gyms were massive stadiums filled with cheering crowds, and gym battles were treated as major sporting events broadcast across the region. Before facing gym leaders, players had to complete gym missions, which were puzzles or challenges themed around each gym's type specialty. The presentation of gym battles as spectator sports gave them more weight and spectacle than in previous generations, though some players felt the actual battles themselves were too easy. The story of Sword and Shield focused on the player's journey to become champion, while uncovering the truth behind Galar's legendary Pokémon and a looming energy crisis called the Darkest Day. The chairman of the Pokémon League, Rose, served as the primary antagonist, believing he needed to cause a controlled version of the Darkest Day to secure energy for Galar's future. The story was criticised for being underdeveloped, with major plot events happening off-screen and character motivations feeling rushed or unclear. The rival, Hop, and the champion, Leon, were highlights, with Hop's character arc dealing with self-doubt and finding his own path receiving particular praise. Pokémon Sword and Shield were released worldwide on November 15, 2019, and immediately became the centre of significant controversy within the Pokémon community. The primary source of controversy was Dexit, the name given to Game Freak's decision not to include all Pokémon in the games. The Galar Regional Pokédex contained only 400 Pokémon, and unlike previous generations where all Pokémon existed in the game's code, even if they weren't catchable in the region, Sword and Shield simply didn't include most Pokémon at all. This meant that players couldn't transfer their favourite Pokémon from previous generations if those species weren't part of Galar's Pokédex. Game Freak explained that the decision was made due to the increasing difficulty of maintaining high-quality animations and models for over 800 Pokémon while also developing new features and content. The studio stated that this would be the new standard going forward, with different regions featuring different selections of Pokémon rather than trying to include everything. This explanation was met with significant backlash from portions of the fanbase who felt that a core principle of Pokémon, bringing your favourites forward from generation to generation, had been violated. The controversy intensified when data miners discovered that many Pokémon models and animations in Sword and Shield were very similar or identical to those from the 3DS games, contradicting the implication that creating new assets for all Pokémon was prohibitively time-consuming. Additionally, critics pointed to other areas where the games felt less polished than expected for a mainline entry on more powerful hardware, including simplistic animations during important story scenes, reused assets, and technical performance issues. Despite the controversy, or perhaps partly because of it, Sword and Shield were massive commercial successes. The game sold over 25 million copies, making them the second best-selling Pokémon games of all time after only the original Red, Blue, and Yellow. Clearly, the Dexit controversy, while significant among vocal online communities, did not substantially impact the game's performance with the broader audience. Many players, particularly younger ones or those new to the series, were unaffected by the limited Pokédex and simply enjoyed the games for what they offered. Critical reception was generally positive but not universally glowing. Reviewers praised the wild area, the spectacle of gym battles, and the quality of life improvements that made training and battling more accessible than ever before. However, many noted that the games felt unambitious compared to other major Switch titles, with relatively simple graphics, limited voice acting, and a story that felt rushed. The games were seen as solid entries in the series, but not the revolutionary leap forward that some had hoped for with Pokémon's move to home console hardware. In January 2020, Game Freak announced an expansion pass for Sword and Shield, marking the first time that mainline Pokémon games received substantial paid DLC rather than a third enhanced version. The expansion pass included two major content drops: the Isle of Armor, released in June 2020, and the Crown Tundra, released in October 2020. Each expansion added new areas to explore, new Pokémon to catch, and new storylines to experience. The Isle of Armor introduced about 100 previously unavailable Pokémon to the Galar Pokédex, including many fan favourites. The expansion focused on training and bonding with Pokémon, featuring a dojo where players learned and competed. New features included the ability to change a Pokémon's ability through a special item, and the introduction of Galarian Slowpoke's evolution line. The Isle of Armor was well received as a solid addition, though some felt it was relatively short for its price. The Crown Tundra was the larger and more substantial of the two expansions. It added another 100 Pokémon to the available roster, bringing the total Gala Pokédex to about 600 Pokémon, though still far short of the full national dex. The expansion featured a snowy region with exploration and investigation at its core. Players could participate in Dynamax adventures, cooperative raids through Max Lair where teams battled through multiple Dynamaxed Pokémon, with the chance to catch legendary Pokémon from previous generations. The Crown Tundra received stronger positive reception than the Isle of Armor, with many praising its focus on exploration and the satisfaction of hunting legendary Pokémon. Between the base games and the expansion content, Generation 8 ultimately provided a substantial amount of gameplay and content. The decision to use DLC, rather than creating a third version like Pokémon Gun or Eclipse, was generally viewed positively, as it meant players didn't need to purchase an entirely new game to experience the additional content. However, the fact that the DLC was paid content that added back Pokémon that had been in previous games left some players feeling that they were being charged for features that should have been included from the start. In February 2021, Game Freak released remakes of Diamond and Pearl, but with a twist. Instead of developing them in-house as had been done with previous remakes, these were outsourced to Ilka, formerly known as A-Link CA Comensist, a studio with experience in Pokémon support work but not as a lead developer on a mainline title. Pokémon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were extremely faithful remakes, recreating the original games with a chibi art style reminiscent of the original DS sprites, but rendered in 3D. These games were considered part of Generation 8 in terms of release timing, though they used the Generation 4 battle system and mechanics rather than Generation 8 systems. The reception to Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl was mixed. Players appreciated the faithfulness to the originals and the quality of life improvements that made certain tedious aspects more bearable. However, many felt the remakes were too faithful, not adding enough new content or making sufficient improvements to justify their existence alongside the originals. The chibi art style was divisive, with some finding it charming and others feeling it looked cheap or overly simplistic. Sales were strong at over 15 million copies, but the games were seen as a step down from the highly praised Heart Gold and Soul Silver or Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire remakes. Also in February 2021, Pokémon Company announced Pokémon Legends, Arceus, a radical departure from the traditional Pokémon formula. Set in ancient Sinnoh, called Hisui in the past. Legends. Arceus featured action RPG elements, open-world exploration, and a focus on observation and research rather than just battling. Players could dodge attacks in real time, sneak up on wild Pokémon, and catch them without battling. The game was released in January 2022, technically making it part of Generation 8's era, and represented Game Freak's most experimental mainline adjacent release yet, Legends. Arceus was widely praised for its willingness to reinvent Pokémon's formula. Critics and players appreciated the emphasis on exploration, the satisfying catching mechanics, and the fresh take on familiar concepts. The game sold over 14 million copies despite its experimental nature, suggesting significant appetite for innovation within the Pokémon fanbase. Legends. Arceus raised hopes that future Pokémon games might continue to experiment with new ideas rather than strictly adhering to established formulas. Generation 8 was a transitional and sometimes turbulent period for Pokémon. The move to Switch brought both opportunities and growing pains. The Dexit controversy revealed tensions between Game Freak's development capacity and fan expectations. The The Entire History of Pokémon Script, Part 4, Final, use of DLC showed new ways to extend game lifespans without requiring completely new purchases. And experiments like Legends. Arceus demonstrated that Pokémon could successfully branch out from its traditional structure. By 2021, as Generation 8 drew to a close, the franchise was preparing for its next evolution, having learned valuable lessons about balancing tradition with innovation and managing fan expectations in an era of increased scrutiny. Generation 9 represents Pokémon's most ambitious attempt yet to fully embrace open-world game design. After experimenting with semi-open areas like the wild area in Sword and Shield and the open zones in Legends, Arceus, Game Freak committed to creating a truly open world for Scarlet and Violet. The Paldea region, inspired by the Iberian Peninsula, particularly Spain and Portugal, would be almost entirely explorable from the early stages of the game, with players free to tackle challenges in whatever order they chose. This represented a fundamental restructuring of how Pokémon adventures were designed and experienced. The development of Scarlet and Violet was led by Shigeru Omori once again, with the team facing the enormous challenge of creating Pokémon's first fully open-world experience. The scope of the project was massive, requiring not just the creation of a large, seamless environment, but also the redesign of progression systems, level scaling, and story structure to accommodate player freedom. These ambitions, while noble, would ultimately lead to some of the most significant technical issues in any mainline Pokémon release. Generation 9 introduced 103 new Pokémon, along with several regional variants called Paldean forms. The new creatures reflected the Mediterranean-inspired setting, with designs drawing from Spanish culture, Iberian wildlife, and regional mythology. Notable additions included the 3 starters Sprigatito, Fuecoco, and Quaxley, which evolved into the grass dark Meowscarada, fire ghost Skieldurge, and water-fighting Quaquaval. Legendary Pokémon Koraidon and Miraidon served as the box legends, doubling as rideable companions that could run, swim, climb, and eventually glide, enabling exploration of the vast open world. The most significant gameplay innovation was the complete freedom of exploration and progression. After completing a brief tutorial area, players were released into Paldea with the ability to go almost anywhere and tackle the 3 main storylines in any order. The Victory Road storyline involved challenging 8 gyms in any sequence to eventually face the Elite Four. The Path of Legends had players helping a character named Arven defeat 5 Titan Pokémon to obtain special herbs, and Starfall Street focused on taking down 5 bases of Team Star, a group of students who'd become rebellious outcasts. This 3-storyline structure was designed to give players meaningful choices about how to experience the game. Each storyline had its own tone and focus, appealing to different player preferences. Victory Road was the traditional gym challenge for those who enjoyed classic Pokémon progression. Path of Legends featured a more personal story about friendship, loss, and caring for others. Starfall Street explored themes of bullying, belonging, and found family. The stories could be pursued simultaneously or sequentially, and players could switch between them freely, creating personalized journeys through Paldea. The open-world design required rethinking how difficulty scaling worked. Rather than having strictly linear progression, the game featured different level ranges in different areas. Players who wandered into high-level areas early would face challenges beyond their current capabilities, while sticking to suggested paths kept encounters manageable. This created a sense of genuine exploration and discovery, as players could stumble upon powerful Pokémon or difficult battles unexpectedly. However, it also meant that the traditional sense of carefully calibrated difficulty progression was somewhat lost. Terastallization was Generation Live's signature battle mechanic, replacing Dynamax from the previous generation. Terastallization allowed any Pokémon to change its type or enhance its existing type once per battle by crystallizing and taking on a gem-like appearance. Each individual Pokémon had a Terra type, which could be the same as one of its regular types or something completely different. A Fire-type Pokémon might terastallize into a Water type, completely changing its defensive profile and offensive options. This mechanic added strategic depth, as players had to consider not just a Pokémon's regular typing, but also its Terra type, and when to activate the transformation. Unlike Mega Evolution or Z-moves, Terastallization was generally well received from the start. The mechanic felt less gimmicky and more integrated into battles, as it could be used by any Pokémon and created meaningful strategic decisions. The ability to change a Pokémon's Terra type through special items also gave players control over customization, allowing them to build teams with unexpected type combinations. Competitive players in particular appreciated the depth that terastallization added to battling. The story of Scarlet and Violet, when all three paths converged, revealed itself to be one of the most emotionally complex narratives in Pokémon history. Without spoiling too much, the game dealt with themes of artificial intelligence, identity, grief, and letting go. The Path of Legends revealed a heartbreaking story about Arven and his relationship with his neglectful parent. Starfall Street showed how bullying and institutional failure could push students into isolation. And the overarching narrative touched on questions about consciousness, what makes something alive, and the ethics of creation and abandonment. The climax of the story brought all three paths together in a way that was unexpected and genuinely moving for many players. The post-game area, Area Zero, was a massive crater in the center of Paldea filled with mysterious Pokémon and ancient technology. This forbidden zone served as the setting for the story's conclusion and offered some of the most challenging encounters in the game. The visual design of Area Zero was striking, with crystalline structures and paradox Pokémon that appeared to be either ancient ancestors or futuristic relatives of modern Pokémon, depending on which version players owned. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet were released worldwide on November 18th, 2022. The games immediately became the center of intense discussion, not primarily about their design or content, but about their technical state at launch. Scarlet and Violet suffered from severe performance issues, including frequent frame rate drops, pop-in of environmental objects and Pokémon, glitches that caused characters or Pokémon to behave erratically, and various visual bugs. These technical problems were so widespread and noticeable that they dominated much of the conversation around the game's release. Critics were divided in their assessments. Many praised the ambition of the open-world design, the emotional depth of the story, and the fun of freely exploring Paldea with friends in co-op mode. However, the technical issues were impossible to ignore, with some reviewers calling them the worst performance problems in any first-party Nintendo game. Metacritic scores reflected this division, with the games receiving generally positive but not exceptional reviews. The consensus seemed to be that underneath the technical issues was an excellent Pokémon game trying to break through. Despite the technical controversies, Scarlet and Violet were massive commercial successes. The game sold over 10 million copies in their first 3 days, breaking records for Nintendo Switch launches. As of late 2024, the games have sold over 25 million copies, matching Sword and Shield's impressive sales. This demonstrated that while technical performance matters to critics and engaged fans, the broader audience was willing to overlook issues for the promise of an open-world Pokémon adventure. Game Freak released patches that addressed some of the most egregious technical issues, though the games never reached a state of perfect performance. The fact that the games launched in such a rough state sparked discussions about Pokémon's development cycle and whether annual or near-annual releases were sustainable, given the increasing complexity of modern game development. Many observers suggested that Pokémon would benefit from longer development periods to ensure technical polish, though Nintendo and the Pokémon Company's business model seemed to prioritize regular releases. The hidden treasure of Area Zero DLC was announced for Scarlet and Violet, following the model established by Sword and Shield's expansion pass. The first part, the Teal Mask, was released in September 2023, adding the land of Kitakami, a rural Japanese-inspired area, along with new Pokémon, characters and storylines. The second part, the Indigo Disc, launched in December 2023, featuring the Terrarium, a massive biodome beneath the ocean containing diverse biomes, and the Blueberry Academy, a school focused on Pokémon battling. The DLC was generally well received, with many feeling it offered more polished experiences than the base game. The Indigo Disc in particular featured an extensive post-game that brought back numerous legendary Pokémon and included challenging battles against previous game protagonists. The DLC continued Scarlet and Violet's themes while expanding the lore and giving players more content to explore. Combined with the base games, the complete Scarlet and Violet experience represented one of the largest and most content-rich Pokémon adventures ever created. Generation 9 represents Pokémon at a crossroads. The series is fully committed to open-world design, embracing player freedom and non-linear progression in ways that fundamentally change how Pokémon games feel to play. The storytelling has matured significantly, tackling complex emotional themes with genuine nuance. The battle mechanics continue to evolve, with terastallization adding new strategic dimensions. And the commercial success demonstrates that demand for Pokémon remains incredibly strong, even as the games grow more ambitious. However, Generation 9 has also exposed the strains on Game Freak's development process. The technical state of Scarlet and Violet's launch raised serious questions about whether the current development cycle is sustainable. The pressure to release new games regularly, driven by the multimedia nature of the Pokémon franchise with its anime, cards, merchandise and other products, all dependent on new generations, may be pushing the development team beyond what they can reasonably accomplish while maintaining quality standards. As Generation 9 continues with its DLC and updates, speculation has already begun about what Generation X might bring. Will Game Freak continue to push toward even more ambitious open-world designs? Will there be another dramatic shift in formula like Legends, Arceus represented? Will the development process be restructured to allow for more polish and optimization? These questions remain unanswered, but they reflect a franchise that, even after nearly 30 years, continues to evolve, experiment, and push boundaries.